Hello, and welcome to the creator commentaries of Sonic Stop Motion Adventures Season 3, starting off here with Episode 20, Tables Turned. The series, as you can see, now sports a brand new opening featuring a cover of Live and Learn from Jonathan Parecki's Sonic Adventure 2 rock cover featuring Swiggles 1987. Actually, it's a rock medley, but yeah, it's a cover for all intents and purposes. At the time, I was very thrilled with how this title card came out, and you know, comparing it to what I can do now, I'm still not by any means like an artist, but, you know, comparing it to what I've done recently, it doesn't look the best. The poses are a little stiff, but especially that shadow, I was so happy with how it looked and how I got his head shape correct. It was definitely the best looking title card at the time. So I've talked a little bit about landmark episodes in previous commentaries, episodes that anchor the show at certain points and ones that really stick out to me for one reason or another. This is without a doubt one of the biggest ones. Not counting the Bedlam arc, if I had to label only 2 episodes in the series as landmark episodes, it would be episode 11 and this one. The time between episodes 19 and 20 was at the time my longest hiatus between episodes. A big part of this was writer's block and trying to get something that stuck, and at the end of it I pulled through with what you see now. When I dropped the trailer for this, I made a big deal about how the show was back, and I even said sorry for the wait in the trailer itself, which is a little crazy to think about now. As a whole, this one went over so well, and I came out of it feeling like I had done everything right. People in the comments were loving it, and when I had the private call with the boys, where I screened it for the first time, the reception it got was golden. And not only was it the start of Season 3, which is the best season of the show by far, it was also episode 20, a milestone in its own right. So yeah, as a whole, this one's really important to me. It's true for other episodes as well, but currently in the show's canon, Bedlam is watching all of these events unfold and observing how the characters abuse the emeralds. I had a good amount of foresight with Bedlam, but not enough to already know at the time I was making this that yeah, he's watching, or even knowing what he was going to turn into as a character, and, you know, that the emeralds would play a much larger role in the conflict in the finale. But what I did here coincides with the character and the end conflict, you know, pretty well. Speaking of the emeralds, I thought the plan of splitting all 7 up made sense, especially after Tails had 3 stolen from his place by Robotnik and thinking he might do so again. You know, having them spread out the emeralds and making it harder for them to steal, or for him, Robotnik, to steal, makes sense. And of course, it works in tandem with the episode's conflict. Going back to that little moment with Sonic and Tails doing that bro fist thing, I still really like how it came out, even though it's imperfect. Something I've learned through doing stop motion for all these years is that sometimes it's the little things you show, especially when it comes to visually showing what these characters are like.
I'm happy all my plans to eradicate Sonic are failing. It's practically how I get my jollies now.
Oh, well, that's good.
Of course something...
Coming up, you'll hear Robotnik refer to his plan from episode 18 as his EDS plan, which stands for Eggman Digital System. I thought I should probably give it a name, at least in hindsight, instead of just referring to it like, oh, when I made the digital thing, remember? You know, from episode 18. This idea of having the emeralds negatively affect the characters and essentially make them hostile and turn on others comes from an old episode idea I wrote down sometime back in 2012. The idea was that it would reverse just about every character. All the good guys would become bad and all the bad guys would become good. The only one that wouldn't be affected in any way would be Sonic, but I never came up with a good reason as to why. Anyway, I would have had Sonic team up with Robotnik to fight off Sonic's friends, as he would have been considered a good guy for that episode before Sonic found a way to revert everything. I took remnants of that idea, incorporated it here, writing in the involvement with the Chaos Emeralds and taking a somewhat more streamlined approach. I never did come up with a reason as to why everything would have been reversed anyway in that beta idea. A lot of people were quick to point out that Eggman has a Google image result search of Rouge the Bat in the background. I feel like it's a funny Easter egg, but that maybe I could have obscured it a little more so it wasn't super easy to make out. That little cone on the corner of Robotnik's desk is the Brigade Leader cone from Haruhi. I don't know what you actually call it, because it's not a cone, it's like a triangular Prism? Is that what it's called? Whatever. Going back to the old episode idea, it comes from a document I had in the early days that I would write down just about any general idea that came to mind while working on the show. Remember, back then, I would basically come up with each episode as I went, and it was rare up until around episode 23 that I knew what I was going to be doing next, at least in a very descriptive way. One thing I wrote down on that document that always stuck with me was Knuckles loses his voice and has to get it back. That was the plot of an episode. That is all I wrote down. But I essentially had the idea for Robotnik to zap Knuckles and somehow steal his voice, and he would be mute for the rest of the episode and have to explain to others and help get it back, stuff like that. Another one was before Sonic could date Amy, he had to defeat her 7 exes, which is straight up copied from Scott Pilgrim, and I think I put it down more as a playful idea than something I would actually explore. More of an idea like, hey, if I ever run out of ideas, here's something to fall back on. Needless to say, I'm glad neither of those ever happened. There is one episode that I had seriously planned on, but never got to for a number of reasons, which was a Sonic and Amy breakup episode. The conflict was going to arise much like it does here, with Robotnik sending a negative chaos signal out, only affecting those characters that were close to it, but it wouldn't make them mindlessly hostile and, physically aggressive. It would just make them sort of more passive-aggressive. It would amplify existing emotions. Sonic and Amy would have been having a conversation near one of the Chaos Emeralds that turned into an argument, and they would end up saying things that they don't really mean and turn into them breaking up, with the rest of the episode focusing on both of their perspectives, Sonic talking with Knuckles and Amy talking with Blaze, on how they feel like they both screwed up. At the end of the episode, they would get back together and then investigate the Chaos Emerald. As you can see in the finished episode 20, I took part of that idea and part of the idea where characters turned good and evil or whatever, and, took the best of both worlds and put them together. As you might have noticed earlier, I tried to match the colors of the emeralds to the corresponding character. Sonic takes the blue, Knuckles takes the red, Espio takes the purple, etc. Taking into consideration how canonically Bedlam is watching these events unfold, Robotnik sending out his negative chaos signal to affect the emeralds is exactly the kind of thing that would piss Bedlam off. It's also placing the emeralds under more stress, so if Robotnik never sent this signal out, Bedlam would have appeared later than he ended up appearing in episode 24. And even by the end of this, when Sonic uses the emeralds, he doesn't come out any less guilty. Watching the show now without any knowledge of what the emeralds are and anything that gets explained later, it might look like Sonic just wins and all is well in the end. But if you were to come back and watch this after knowing all of the things about how the Chaos Emeralds shouldn't be used and stuff like that, there's this added sense of danger or tension, at least viewing the emeralds as a double-edged sword. If they use them, they can get out of troublesome situations, but at the same time, they're pushing up the inevitable appearance of Bedlam and placing themselves in more danger while they don't even know it. I'm going to talk about Sonic's set for a second. The bed was made from a metal holder for post-it notes turned upside down and covered with paper, and the pillow is actually just a pink eraser. I thought all that combined looked enough like a bed, at least more than a Sega Genesis cartridge covered in tissues. The area where the bed is, with the corner and the little overhang, had been part of Sonic's house set in every iteration before I upgraded to how it looks now. I think there actually used to be some kind of wall like halfway through it that I eventually took down. In that overhang area, you can see a poster for the film Chronicle, which is one of my favorite films, and I think it actually stays on the wall up until the very end of the series. One of the images that I never moved because I simply love showing some love for that movie. Not a lot of people talk about it. And the floor for that section is some environmental sprites from Green Hill, Marble, and Chemical Plant Zone that I copy-pasted over and over to make it look like a little pattern. And you can see that the purple wall behind it actually uses the same Marble Zone sprite texture. In the background you can see Lenny, the little binocular man from Toy Story.
Oh, why does he always have to be after us? He needs to find a hobby that isn't trying to kill me.
You said that time, and just before you changed just now felt the same way, right? You told me you turned into a sort of dark version of yourself just before you escaped that program, didn't you?
Yeah, you're right. Oh, I get it. He must have done something to turn all the emeralds into dark emeralds or something. Oh, once I find where he's hiding, I'll sock him right in the...
Sonic, never mind that for now.
What's up?
Throughout the series, you can spot a couple of custom things I made at one point or another. That includes a checkpoint marker, a signpost with Sonic's face on it, a little ring capsule, and a few other things, all of which were made out of cardboard for the most part. In the previous scene, Tails was able to neutralize Sonic by just hitting him with an emerald, but it does not work on Espio here, kind of implying that there was some sort of time limit to having these characters. Like, there was a certain amount of time they could be neutralized, and then once that time was out, they had to just, I guess, be beaten up. It's kind of reminiscent of the cliche of the mind-controlled characters fighting their friends, and when they're unable to come to their senses, they either get an emotional speech or they just get pummeled into the ground until the effect wears off. Sometimes to get a character to regain their senses, you know, true love's kiss is involved. Other times, just crack their skulls open and hope for the best. Having Tails actually participate in the fight right here was a nice change of pace, since I seldom do it in the show. He's usually just the brains behind the operations and not the brawn, but having him punch Espio was kind of fun. Speaking of which, I swapped out his hands for the fists so I could, you know, make it look like he's actually punching Espio and not opened hand slapping him over and over. And I swapped out Sonic's hand right here when he grabs the emerald, and I thought it looked pretty cool, so I kept it for the rest of the scene. Even though it's a little distracting because you know I switched it, and it almost seems like I left it unintentionally, but I don't know. And hey, look, there's Lenny and the same life capsule that appeared in Sonic's house. And that's the same bed back there, too. It looks like I, for some reason, used a lot of the same exact items between both sets. And that's the only time I would really do so, since the Chaotix base looked different furniture-wise before and after this episode.
We need to go check on the others we gave emeralds to.
I'll go too. It sounds like you might need the extra help.
I'll get a hold of all the others that didn't get an emerald from us. Hopefully they're uninfected and can help us out.
Good idea. Now come on, we gotta hurry.
Yeah.
Roger. So, who should we check on first?
I think Amy's house is the closest from here. Hey, speaking of which, why did we stop, Tails?
We're just waiting for the others. I told them to meet up with us here.
As I mentioned in the last commentary, Gilnov and Musel make their debut performances as Vector and Blaze, respectively, roles they held for the entire rest of the show. And once Gilnov takes over for Gyro, the Radnik, in the next episode, that is the last recasting that we see. Speaking of Blaze, this is a different individual Blaze figure than the one I used in episode 17, since that one started to have some movement problems and overall the paint looked much better on the one I used here, especially in the face. In these first shots where she appears, you can see that the coattails piece looks normal, but the following shots have it cut in the middle. This is because the coattails piece is a separate piece of plastic on the Jazzwares figure that sits between the legs and the torso parts of the figure. Well, it must have been like too tight or something for the joint peg to get through, and it had her torso just kind of sitting on top without it clicking into place. So once I cut it in half, that allowed it for the torso to actually, you know, click onto the figure and make it look normal. So for the rest of the episode and for the rest of the series, Blaze has that piece of plastic cut down the middle. When I opened this episode with saying that at the time it felt like I did everything right, that extends to the combat as well. When this episode went up, it was the best looking action in any of my episodes, in my opinion. And coming off of the heels of episode 19, it just felt like a breath of fresh air when it came to choreographing and shooting for it. Last episode, Sonic fought a much larger foe in the form of Zalvandor, so by nature it was harder to tackle that combat on top of the Excalibur Sonic figure already being difficult to work with. Here, everyone was fighting against someone who was their relative size, with the slight exception of Vector, and most of the figures were fairly easy to work with as far as, you know, Jazzwares Sonic figures go. I was trying to move the camera and change shot composition less here because I had something of a habit of when I'd shoot in earlier episodes of sort of resetting where the figures are standing from shot to shot, to the point where it was a little strange and kind of distracting. A non-combat example is back in episode 16 when Knuckles has to go get the snacks. He's facing one way in one shot and the opposite in another shot. It just looks weird. So those are a few reasons why I had multiple punches and exchanges in combat happen in single shots here. It looks a little static now, especially when they're all profile, but that's compared to what followed. At the time, it did look better, and it was a step in the right direction.
Whoa, what was that all? Ouch.
Hey, Knuckles, come at me, bro. Haha, because you say bro, right?
What happened?
The effect I use for Espio to poof in and out of being in shot is just a simple effect, and it's chroma keyed smoke puff, but I think it always looks so satisfying for him to appear and disappear underneath it. For this shot, the tops of the buildings were added digitally. If I hadn't done that, you would just see the tops and insides of a bunch of cardboard boxes. Doing something like that where you can see Sonic up in the air and the camera's pointed downward was really new for the show at the time. I think I remember having the screening of this episode and Chris reacted like, whoa, because we hadn't seen anything like that, you know, here. There was this awesome fan art of this scene done in one of the fan art contests by a man named Stephen Jones. He participated in other fan art contests, including the most recent one, but his piece back then was traditional, and he rendered the characters to make it look like the actual Jazzwares figures, which I always got a kick out of. I believe he won because of his entry, so shout out to him. And here is a big part of the episode. People really like seeing Sonic and Shadow fight, and you know what? So do I. I enjoyed making them fight, especially since this was the first time they did so in the series. Making him the final boss of the corrupted characters made sense and served the episode well. The thumbnail for this episode is based on the frame in the fight between the two where their arms collide. Only it was actually it was not that specific shot. I had cut out both figures as PNGs and swapped a separate shot for the background, and then cropped it a little bit.
Control.
A lot of fight scenes in Season 2 had pretty bad pacing, and they didn't feel like they're happening fast enough. Even in 19, some shots here and there, you know, the timing just made them feel sluggish. Here is where that trend really starts to be broken. This final fight of the episode where the action looks the best. The combat between Sonic and Shadow is really quick and feels much more energetic than past fights. The thing about making fights happen quickly is that it is a lot of work for only seconds of animation. I mean, that can be said for the entire show in general, I know, but it's especially true for animating and editing fight sequences. So while I shot, it felt like it was taking forever to capture everything, and it was going to be pretty long, but when I got around to editing it, that fight only lasts about 2 minutes, which actually still isn't that bad. I bring back a concept from Season 1 here, which was a Mach Super form, and yes, if I had to give it an actual name, it is Mach Supersonic, as in M-O-C-K. I accomplished the look by swapping Supersonic's head onto the normal Sonic body and then, you know, changing the color in Photoshop. Looking back, I could have made it match the blue better. It just looks a little too vibrant. I also colored the eyes green as well, to make it look like he was truly in Mach Super. I had such major fun when it came to the music for this episode, in particular the fight between Sonic and Shadow, where I used covers of Blackened by Metallica and Perfect Insanity by Disturbed. I used a lot of covers in my show because almost all of the time they don't get copyright matched and I could still use the song that I had in mind in some way. Back there we saw the first instance of Chaos Control Spear, a new move I made for Shadow, which is like Chaos Spear except it freezes the enemy in place. For the effect, I just made the normal Chaos Spear effects green and then have the target flash inverted colors when they got hit.
Yeah, crazy, right?
I'd say so.
So, I'm gonna take a wild shot in the dark here, but I've got a hunch that this was because of the doctor, no? Well, that's what we think. I'm not gonna bore you with the specifics now, but a good amount of evidence points to him being behind this. This whole thing's insane! Hey, I put up a good
I have both Sonic and Shadow upset at the outcome of the fight at the end here, and I even teased them one day being able to have a rematch. It's a very Goku and Vegeta dynamic in that way. Only thing is, they never get said rematch. It never happens. The closest I have is when they're training in preparation to the final fight of the series, but that isn't an actual no-holds-barred match. It's just sparring. After this, there wasn't much needed for a Sonic and Shadow bout, so it fell through. I didn't even really have concrete plans to do one at the time. I mostly set it up here as a if and when situation. I had written a line for Shadow to say here that I ended up cutting, where he states that Sonic had 6 emeralds and he only had 1, so it wasn't fair. I got rid of it because I didn't think Shadow would actually say something like that. If they're arguing about who would win in a fight, he's not really one to make excuses. Early episodes, like almost all of Season 1, were completed in a very short amount of time. A few of the episodes even had all pictures taken in only a day. I think like the first 4 episodes did. How far I had come between then and now, as in episode 20 now. Even though I would continue to improve every episode, I was now settling into the norm of things. I was already getting used to setting up and taking down all of my sets multiple times and shooting across multiple days, and then editing for multiple weeks. I was using the same camera, microphone, and editing program that I would for the remainder of the show, and the voice actors were consistent from here on out. I think this was the perfect way to set up and introduce Season 3 of the show, and remains an episode that I hold very dear. This came out on June 6th, which, if memory serves, was like the very last day of my junior year before summer break in high school. I was driving at that point, so being able to finish the episode, upload it, and then go have my last day of school before summer and then drive myself home to summer vacation where I could relax was forever a mood, and kind of makes me nostalgic. You know, I have a sneaking suspicion that it might not have worked.
Shut up.
Episode 21, Curtain Call. This episode went up on December 23rd, 2014, about 6 months after episode 20. This was about half the time of my previous hiatus, which is a good thing. When I make trailers for my episodes, I usually upload them about a week before the episode itself goes live, but this one was very different, as the trailer went up on the 21st, only 2 days before the actual episode went up. I did this because I ran out of time to post the trailer earlier, and I wanted this episode out before Christmas. The Radniks play a very prominent role in this episode, which I was very excited about. I've talked about how I really do like them as a group of characters back in episodes 15 and 17, so bringing them all back here and even opening on them was, it really made me happy. This apartment set was meant to look really bland and empty, and I think I conveyed it exactly how I wanted it to. The portrait they hang up on the wall, I had so much fun editing in Photoshop to make it look like a family portrait. I placed a frame around it in Photoshop and then printed it out and stuck it onto a thick piece of cardboard to make it look like it's popping off the wall. The portrait was actually one of the prints I had made up for sale at Sonic Revolution 2016. And the only other thing in the apartment up until the end of the episode is a little desktop computer sitting in the corner, which looks so silly to me. I love it. Why would these are robots. They have computers in them. It's funny that they would need a little desktop. The golden frame on the door back there is of course a reference to the TV series Friends, as it is the same frame that was around the keyhole in Monika's apartment. The door in this set does not actually open, it was simply cardboard taped to the wall. I never needed it to open. This scene marks my very first instance of using lamps to light a scene, because I wanted it to look much different from all other sets in more ways than just being empty. I still use natural lighting for a majority of the series, but I would continue to use lamps intermittently when scenes called for changed lighting like that. I got them in the first place because of the stage play, I obviously knew the play in this episode needed actual lighting and to look much different, but I thought they would serve the Radnick apartment scene pretty well, and, you know, I think they did. Actually giving the Radnicks an apartment was something I decided on because I didn't want them all to just live with Tails. I wanted them to start off there but branch out into leading their own lives. And it's shown here that they are having money trouble and can't seem to land any jobs. This episode is currently my most viewed and has been for quite a while now, currently sitting at a whopping, approximately, 12.4 million views. And honestly, I'm really happy that it's this one, because in terms of my all-time favorite episodes of my own show, episode 26 and 27 are right there at the top, and I count them together. But right after that is episode 21. Whenever I would come out with a new episode, you know, that one was my favorite, the one that I just finished. And as I moved forward and made more after this, I looked back at it certainly as an accomplishment, but now more than ever, I look back at 21 and I am so pleased with how everything was done here. It was different than a lot of what I had done before and after it, and it stands out as a shining, unique episode of Season 3. With this and the following episode 22, you see more happenings in the show with slice of life stuff, especially in 22, but I don't look back on 22 nearly as fondly. I was certainly trying new things in my show and trying to break the formula. At this point, it was really easy to have the conflict be resolved with combat and have every episode end with a fight scene. And while this episode still does have a fight scene at the end of it, the central conflict was not tied to it. Compare it to, say, episode 20, where the central conflict is that several characters get corrupted or possessed by this negative chaos signal. The solution to that is to fight and beat up all the characters. The conflict in this episode is on a much smaller scale in comparison, with the Radnicks not being able to make rent. And then trying to find a solution for it. The solution is not combat or an action scene, but rather putting on a play that eventually gets interrupted by Robotnik, which initiates the fight scene. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how, at the time of writing this episode, I did feel like I was leaning on a crutch when I added the fight scene of this episode. It was a safe, familiar territory to end with, and you know, it was a kind of guaranteed hit in a way. I've done fighting before and I could do it after. So when it came to episode 22, I finally did an episode with no single fight, but that episode also does not stand out as much, so take of that what you will. I love every scene in this episode from the beginning to the end, especially this one where they're trying to convince Shadow to play the villain in the play. These right here are the scenes that made my show so much fun to work on. Taking these established characters and putting them into my own situations while trying to maintain the attributes of, you know, what makes those characters who they are is rewarding. And getting it right, or at least trying to get it right, was, you know, it was part of the fun. And here I showed how the same character responds to other characters differently. Shadow's pretty hostile towards Sonic, but when Tails asks him basically the same question, he's a little more civilized towards him, and then he even blushes and gets flustered when Amy is being nice to him. And the whole thing with Sonic basically baiting Shadow with acting cocky and better than him is just great. I like having Sonic and Shadow interact with each other. I believe around this time I was, you know, experimenting with color correction to an extent, but I still wasn't color correcting every frame. Or at least not in the way that I would later, and the way that became the norm. While I had started to vary the lengths of frames in any given motion in episode 19, 20 and 21 is when I truly settled into animating that way, and it became the look of the show's animation that remained constant.
But know this, I'm gonna be the one to steal the show.
Well, now that that's settled, how about we contact the others? I can do my best to direct this play, but we're gonna need all the help we can get.
Agreed. Hey, thanks for helping us out, Shadow. You're alright.
You know, Shadow, you might act cold a lot, but you can actually be pretty nice.
Yeah, whatever.
Alright, we've got actors to find, sets to make, and a script to learn front to back. We can't waste any time, guys. Let's get to work!
This is one of the things about this episode that makes me like it as much as I do. I had never done a montage in my show, and I was really excited to show the entire process of them getting this play together in a short amount of time. A lot happens in this episode, but it's all wrapped together in 23.5 minutes, and is, I think, one of the best examples of me finding the perfect balance in an episode like this. That shot back there with Sonic holding the skeleton head, clearly a reference to Hamlet. It is the head from the Revoltech Jack Skellington that I had at the time. Those two lights that turn on are the actual lamps that I used in my show, and I never got any new lamps. They're the lamps I continued to use for the rest of the series. All the extra characters you see in this show were figures I had at the time, since I was heavily into buying and collecting Figuarts and Figma figures, stuff like that. Since I was also a big anime fan, most of them were also anime figures, and I think some of their designs are a little too specific to work as background characters. You know, I was working with what I had, but, you know, it's like, oh, there's the Lelouch from Code Geass, there's Asuna, there's Haruhi, like, that's, you know. Making the play's poster was a lot of fun, and I specifically wanted a crooked sign to be tacked over it saying that it was tonight, a very easy way to show passage of time. The concept of putting them in a play stems a little from how, for so long, I wanted to do a musical performance or talent show to be a part of my series. That stuff is really fun to write, but sometimes can be really hard to pull off in stop-motion animation, especially a musical performance, which obviously needs to be synced to specific audio throughout. My friend Chris made 2 awesome stop-motions back in the day that were both musical performances, so please check them out if you have not. I can't remember now how I eventually settled in, you know, doing a play for these characters, but I had so much fun writing something that was intended to be bad. You know, in the show's canon, the play was written by Amy, so it's essentially these characters coming together to act out some fan fiction written by a then tweenage girl. As an extension of this, changing my performances for the characters I voiced to reflect how most of them are not good at acting was a blast. It's bad source material performed by bad actors to basically make this play a train wreck. The only one who was actually decent in his performance was Shadow, who I made appear more cultured than the rest of the group, and took some slight inspiration from Baylina Productions' Christmas with Sonic series, where Shadow is like a chef and he's like a fancy man. All the backgrounds used on this stage were pictures I edited slightly to give it a, like, you know, painterly look, and then I printed them out on a large enough scale, taped them to cardboard planks that could slide in and out of the shot, and, you know, there you go. In terms of the overall set, I made a behind the scenes on it on my second channel, but it was essentially these large wooden blocks that acted as the stage itself, and then I made a little spot for the background and a backstage area. How I shot everything in this scene was with nothing in between the stage and the camera. The audience was not there. It would have been needlessly complicated to shoot over stationary figures when they wouldn't even be appearing on camera. For the one shot later where you see both, I simply took a separate shot of the audience, made it a PNG, and layered it over to make it look like they're both there. My goal in this play was to make it appear as bad as possible, and I found that some of the most fun I've had is making something that's supposed to be bad. Sometimes when we make our own projects, we don't necessarily know what is good, but we definitely know what is bad. So playing directly to that here was an opportunity in my show unlike any other. Having Knuckles forget his lines and read directly off the script, not realizing how close Dash is to him, having Silver faint from being too shy in front of Blaze, and overall just the dialogue of the play, it all combines into a disaster. There were lines like, "Give a man a boat, you teach him how to fish. Teach a man to boat, the man becomes a fish," which was complete nonsense and a wrong version of the actual saying. Then lines like, "We were on our way to save the princess from an evil," which were more based on how me and my friend's sense of humor was back in the day, of just saying things incorrectly and sounding stupid doing so. A lot of the naming of the characters in the play also come from inside jokes, including Sonic playing Bonnick, the Radnik characters named King Robit, Garfield, and Gooby, and then Silver plays Slavic the Sorceress, which Slavic was just a stupid way for us to refer to Silver without saying Silver. Bonnick came from a similar jokey way of referring to Sonic. You know, we've called him Snacko, Cinco, Sonko, Snickers. Basically any way you can include the letters in the word Sonic without saying Sonic. Other names like Knuckles playing Bebop the Cowboy, an obvious reference to Cowboy Bebop. Shadow playing Darkness the Evil Demon, which was just something I was like, how can I come up with the most ridiculous, edgy name that I could? And then Amy plays a character named Princess Charlotte de Blanc Françoise Verona La Princessa, which is several jokes and references combined into one. There is an anime called Zero no Tsukaima, or The Familiar of Zero, in which the titular character is named Louise Françoise Leblanc de la Valliere, which I always enjoyed how overly long the name was, so I took that concept. The Françoise Leblanc was turned into Françoise de Blanc, Charlotte was just a name I picked at random, and Verona, Italy is famously the location of Romeo and Juliet, so you have some theatrical referencing in there as well. And then I capped it off with La Princessa, so the full name is essentially Princess Charlotte de Blanc Françoise Verona the Princess. Naruto fans might recognize the Konoha Village Gate as the backdrop right here. Silver's wand is from the Figma witch Yuki Nagato, and then the cape and hat were just made from pink construction paper. I think it looks so silly how the wizard hat just sits on his top spike like a sock or something. Sonic's hat is from the Figma Mami character, spelled M-A-M-I, the character from the Madoka Magica series, and then Knuckles' cowboy hat is from the Revoltech Woody from Toy Story figure. It fits really well on his head, too. And the little hat that Gooby, played by Jorgen, is wearing is from the Figma Nadoka from the K-On! Series. When I was thinking of a name to call the setting of the play, I came up with Rosengard, spelled G-U-A-R-D. But upon Googling it, I found out that Rosengard is a real place in Sweden, spelled, Rosen, G-A-R-D. I didn't want to name the place after an actual place in real life, but secondly, Rosengard, Sweden, apparently has some sort of history with violence, so I changed it to Rosenshire to make everything less complicated. This episode was made during the first semester of my senior year of high school. In my school, seniors did not take a normal English class in their senior year, but rather an English elective. I can't remember what all of the choices were, but I ended up going with Shakespeare 1 and 2. I had gotten slight exposure to Shakespeare in freshman year when we covered Romeo and Juliet, but senior year is where I became accustomed to the traits of his work, such as iambic pentameter and the overall way of speaking. I tried to incorporate that way of speaking into much of this play to give it that old Renaissance feel, even though it is horrible. I wanted like a clashing of, Shakespearean dialogue, but also horrible, misinterpretations of that dialogue from a teenage girl. And that's how we get lines like "Fi, do not force me laughter," and so on. One of the plays we covered in Shakespeare 1 was The Merchant of Venice, which must have been very present in my mind at the time I made this because I incorporated two back-to-back references as key dialogue from the play. One where Shadow asks where is fancy bread, in the heart or in the head, only he states it's in the head, when in The Merchant of Venice it's stated fancy is bread in the heart. The other is when Sonic has his dialogue asking if plebeians and royalty are really all that different. In The Merchant of Venice, the character Shylock is a Jew who poses the same question of if he's deserving of the prejudice he receives.
Because I am in love with the princess! You love the princess? With all my heart. Fi, do not force me laughter! You are nothing but a mere plebeian. How do you expect to marry such royalty? Yea, I am a plebeian. Hath not a plebeian eyes? Hath not a plebeian senses? Affections, passions, warmed and cooled by the same summer and winter as royalty. If you prick us, do we not bleed? Ouch! If you tickle us, do we not laugh? Ha ha ha! If you poison us, do we not die? Ah! And if you wrong us, do we not revenge? If plebeians are like them and the rest, we will resemble royalty in that. A touching story, really, but I do not care for such pointless chit-chat. If you wish to teach me a thing or two, put thy money where...
Here is the shot where we see both the audience and the stage at once. In all the audio that follows with the crowd chattering about how the play is bad, there were some actual lines like, "Oh, this sucks, this is awful, I want my money back," but I also threw in a lot of in-jokes from a lot of audio from other sources. I'm not going to bother listing them all, but you can listen for yourself. You'll notice that Amy has absolutely no costume on, which was a choice made purely out of me not wanting to bother making any kind of costume for her. But maybe in the world of SSMA, she didn't dress up because she always saw herself as this princess from the very beginning and didn't need to add any extra layers to herself to become the character of Princess Charlotte in the play. Just some food for thought. Mega Man, voiced by Gilnov, he also did some of the other audience voices, including Mario and some of the background stuff. Shadow's costume, on the other hand, with the cape and the eye patch was so funny. I forget what material the cape was made out of, but you know, then he has these different colored quills that are added on with tape that is visible. I could have made the tape not visible on him, but I chose to do it that way because I wanted it to look bad. And then of course his white eye patch, which really adds to the over-the-topness of this character. For almost all the shots where Tails leans forward, like he just did right now in my show, they weren't as simple as just moving the character's legs like any other figure. Tails, of course, has his tails behind him, and they're made of solid plastic, so they act as a sort of counterweight and won't typically let him move forward much as a result. So what I did was just take a little ball of the putty that I used for the characters to stand and move it under his tails as he leans forward a little more each frame. The Eggmobile that Robotnik is in is from the Tomy Sonic Boom Eggman set, and honestly, it's one of my favorite things that Tomy made. Not only does it actually look really great, but the Jazzwares Robotnik can fit somewhat snugly in there. This was the only time I ever used it in my show, but I'm glad I was able to, at least once. The motion of Shadow taking off his cape and his eye patch still really holds up in my opinion. I'm so satisfied with how it came out. It's such a simple thing, but like just flicking off the cape and ripping the eye patch off, it's just like, oh, looks so good. Didn't I do such a great job making my thing, guys? Oh, I'm just gonna gush about it. Having Sonic question something and then reply with, oh, in a very quick shot became a subtle running gag in the show. I think the only other time I did it was in episode 23, but maybe I did do it another time. I admit having the Egg Robo be able to shapeshift and then turn into Sonic wasn't a very original idea. This is the kind of thing I was talking about in the sense of the fight feeling like a crutch that I leaned on, and I just decided, oh yeah, he can shapeshift, he turns into Sonic. I think it was serviceable though, and, you know, the fight was short enough for it to not feel like a majority of the episode or anything, lasting just a little over a minute actually. In a strange way though, it kind of saved the play in the end. Everyone was about to complain, or everyone was complaining about how terrible the play was and starting to demand their money back, and that's when Eggman showed up, causing the fight to happen and to get the audience excited again because they thought it was still part of the play. Which again, maybe it's not the most original thing, having something go awry and the audience thinking it's all part of the act, but I think it did its job just fine. And having two Sonics on screen might be confusing, but the second you throw a hat on the real one, bam, the problem's solved. The shots of Robotnik up in the sky were accomplished through cutting out all the frames as PNGs, and when it became Robotnik in the Eggmobile, holding Amy and the Chaos Emerald with Sonic standing on top, it got really difficult to actually have movement, so that's why there really isn't when Sonic jumps up there. There was actually a little scene that I cut where Robotnik turns to Amy and he's like, at least they know how to put on a show, or at least I know how to put on a show. I'll take that as a no, like Amy's just silent. I guess I just cut it because I felt like it broke flow or something. I had to work in Sonic kissing Amy on stage. It was just too cute not to go there. And then of course we got the thumbnail shot with Sonic holding Amy. Definitely a contributing factor to this episode having 12 million views. But if we go off the assumption of views as a result of thumbnails alone, I'm still to this day surprised that this one did better than 18, which had Dark Supersonic in the thumbnail.
Awesome job, guys. With the help we got from the others, we were able to raise more than enough money putting on that play.
You could say that again. With how much we got, we should be fine on rent for a couple of months.
Oh, guys. So, after the play last night, I might have gone out and bought something to celebrate.
You did what?
Check.
Don't worry now, it only cost a couple bucks. Plus, it's something all of us were wanting for the apartment.
So,
And just as it started with the Radniks, it ends with the Radniks, bookending the entire episode. I like how this came out because, of course, the episode opens with them hanging the picture up in their new apartment and then realizing they're out of money. That's when the episode gets opened up to all the other characters, and when the Radniks become less of the focus, you know, the play was really the focus, and Sonic became sort of like the main character for a second. And then, you know, we have the fight, and then after that, we come back to the very same set with only the Radniks, making us believe they were the main characters of the episode all along, even if they didn't have nearly as much dialogue or screen time as Sonic. Upon watching this once again, I found that it's very similar to episode 17 in a lot of ways. The Radniks are a primary aspect of both. They both deal with sort of low-stakes conflict, and in episode 17, the girls hanging out gets interrupted by Metal Sonic, and here, the play gets interrupted by Robotnik. There was a little less than 2 years in between 17 and 21, and I think comparing the two really highlights how I had improved in writing and conceptual stages of the episodes in that time alone. The idea was a lot less anime high school-esque, and an idea that's inherently maybe easier to take seriously compared to boys watching girls talk about their crushes. Episode 22, Date Fright. The second of the Slice of Life duology after 21, and before things in the series really start to take a turn in the next episode. I didn't mention it in episode 20, but that is where the Emerald Arc Part 2 began. Part 1 began sort of tentatively between episodes 13 and 14 and lasted up until 19. The distinguishing factors between Emerald Arc Part 1 and Emerald Arc Part 2 are not only the change from Season 1 to Season 2, but also that in Emerald Arc Part 1, no one has all of the Chaos Emeralds, and in Emerald Arc Part 2, Sonic and the gang have all 7 Chaos Emeralds. Emerald Arc Part 2 lasts up into episode 24, where things then transition into the Bedlam Arc, or the Bedlam Trilogy, if you will, taking place across episodes 25, 6, and 7. So even though this episode has nothing to do with the Chaos Emeralds whatsoever, it is taking place in Emerald Arc Part 2. If this series were an anime, maybe this episode would be called filler, but nothing's really filler here since it's not being adapted from anything, and you know, every episode I took seriously as a production. In that ring capsule back there, you can actually make out my reflection in a few shots in this scene, and the poster behind it clearly says soon, and the logo above it was a beta logo for the Sonic Stop Motion Adventures and Speed Stories crossover. That logo was a mock-up by an artist known as Wes, or Scrib, who also won one of the fan art contests a while back, and his piece is seen on Amy's wall later in this episode. This is when the idea was still on the table and at the forefront of AJ's thoughts and my own, of doing a crossover. We had planned and started writing one years back, but it eventually fell through, and the only thing to survive was my concept for a character that eventually became Bedlam. Around the time I was making this episode, we revived the idea of a crossover and reevaluated how it would work and what we wanted to do with it after having a lot of time to think about it. But it never did happen, and if it ever will is still technically up in the air, but with me stepping away from stop motion altogether, it's not exactly in the stars for me right now. For some reason, I have a crazy vivid memory of like where I was when I got the idea for this episode. In my senior year, I was taking an off-campus class that I drove to on certain days after getting out of normal on-campus classes. And it was on one of those fateful days that this concept of Silver and Blaze going out on a date and involving the Chaotix, it all hit me all when I was like waiting in the parking lot of the off-campus class waiting for it to start. Since Silver and Blaze had a tiny little moment in the last episode, I thought it would be great to open up this one while talking about the play, which in-universe was 2 weeks ago. The poster on the theater is still up, and there's even an added sold out sign over the tonight sign. This is another episode where Sonic is not treated as the main character, instead taking a backseat to Silver for the episode. He is still involved when they go out on the double date. It is fun having the juxtaposition dynamic of Silver and Blaze on their first date along with Sonic and Amy, who it's been established they've been going steady for a while now. The plot of this episode came from me wanting to, again, do a lower stakes slice of life episode, and I wanted to once again tackle romance, but in a different way. In a more teenage first date kind of way, if you will. This is the first and only time we see Silver's house, and the set for it was sort of slapped together fairly quickly because I knew it wasn't going to be shown all that much in the scene, and I had no plans to ever show it again afterwards. The bed and other furniture that appear here are from a bedroom, like a miniature furniture bedroom set from a company called Melissa and Doug. It was nice using actual like dollhouse furniture that looks exactly like what I need it to, instead of like, you know, yeah, this will suffice for a bed. How about just a post-it note holder? The icon above Silver's bed is AJ's icon of Lifeline the Hedgehog, a nod to him since he voiced Silver. This commercial was so much fun to put together, and I edited a full version of it uninterrupted by cuts, which I uploaded on my second channel. Feel free to go watch it if you would like. Wherever it cuts to Silver reacting to it, I kept the actual audio for the commercial running, so its runtime in this episode is the actual runtime of the commercial. I was really stringent on that. It goes back to what I was saying last episode about finding joy in making something intentionally bad. This time not a play, but rather a crummy commercial the Chaotix, headed by Vector, made that is shown probably on some public access channel at 2 or 3 in the morning. Twice I had the boom mic come closer to Vector, and once it even hits him, and there was a line that Gilnov coughed in the middle of as Vector, as him just, you know, coughing in real life from doing the voice, but I kept it in the episode to further cement how it seems rushed and low budget. In the Silver's house portion of this scene, the only light in the room is supposed to be coming from the TV, so I shot it at night with all the lights off and pointed a small flashlight at him to accomplish this look. And when it came to making that little flicker effect from coming off of like the TV light, I rendered the bits of him in his bed after I finished all the motion, and then added a second layer of that, like a copy of that on top of it, and then had the brightness increase and decrease over and over, and then lowered the opacity. If you look on the TV stand in Silver's house, I tried to pack as many little visual references as I could. You can see like a Pokemon Master Ball, Ape Escape I think was there. You can even see the Chow in Space Blu-ray 2-pack from episode 17. I redecorated the Chaotix set here to reflect their current dating service operation, putting hearts and anime character pairings all over the walls. Over next to Espio, you can see a picture of ships and a picture of cannons, as in shipping characters and what is canon to the story. The 2 stars of the episode right here conversing, AJ and Gilnov, gave such great performances as Silver and Vector. The types of lines that I had written for these characters to say made the voice acting sessions that much more entertaining. These are 2 characters that haven't really interacted much in official Sonic things, so it goes back to what I've said about the power you have as a creator, you know, taking characters that can be considered background characters in the games and making them interact, like make Silver and Vector of all people talk about how to act on a first date. When would you ever see something like this other than in fanfiction?
Look, do you want the advice or not?
Yeah, I do. Sorry. Here you go.
Aha! There it is. Now we may begin. Please step into my office. Now, tell me, Silver, how do you think you should treat Blaze on this date of yours?
Well, I think I should treat her kindly and respectfully. You know, like be nice to her and also maybe compliment her to make her feel...
Wrong! You see, women, they love the bad boys. The type of guys who don't listen to nobody. The ones who make their own rules.
I've been saying throughout these commentaries that I made the switch to and edit with Sony Vegas, but Sony doesn't actually own Vegas anymore. The version I use, Vegas Movie Studio 11, was released before Sony sold Vegas and some of their other creative software off to, I believe, a company called Magix. For Movie Studio, I believe the change happened around version 13. Actually, the full name of the program version I have is Sony Vegas Movie Studio HD Platinum 11 Production Suite, but that is one hell of a mouthful. Think of Vegas Movie Studio, which runs for about $50 or so, as sort of a light version compared to Vegas Pro, which can run for a couple hundred. So, there's obviously some stuff that Pro can do that Movie Studio can't. I got Movie Studio 11 back in 2012, and as I record this, I still haven't upgraded any further. That might seem crazy, but everything I've needed to do, I've been able to accomplish in the version I have, and it's done me very well throughout the years. I'd say I certainly got my money's worth. Look and function-wise, Vegas Pro and Movie Studio are almost identical, and I've really enjoyed the program ever since I got it. I've had to basically teach myself mostly everything, obviously through the help of online video tutorials. I'm quite the fan of Vegas's interface, and after I got used to the change, I never looked back. It's crazy too, because at the time, going back to what I have said throughout these commentaries about being a naive kid afraid of change, I was actually on the fence about upgrading from Movie Maker to Vegas, and that sounds ridiculous. The thing that pushed me over the edge and made me go through with getting it was finding out that it supported, of all things, the file format on a camera I had that Movie Maker did not support.
Now, are you gonna take the advice I'm dishing out or not?
Sorry, I will. But you're sure this whole bad boy act is gonna work?
90% of the time, it works. Every time.
That doesn't make sense.
Now, the last piece to make this, how you'd say, perfect bad boy trifecta complete is acting like you're too good for her. You want to act like she's the absolute last thing on your mind and your priorities.
What exactly is the advantage to that?
When it came around to sound editing, the crossing from Season 2 to Season 3 is around the time I started getting more serious about it. At this point, whenever sound effects were used to convey something in my show, I almost always blended multiple sounds at once to accomplish whatever the sound eventually was in the episode. That is especially true in fight scenes. I mean, there were times I stacked like a good 10 sounds on top of each other, or at varying, intervals on the timeline to accomplish certain results. This change is one of the things I love to see, well, I guess hear, most in the progression of my show, because I started with so few sound effects at my disposal and ended up with literally tens of thousands in my own library. When you're not an actual Foley artist, you have to rely on what you can download on the internet, so I've found that blending sounds together can make things much more immersive. Also, if other people that have done similar things are watching what you made, they can pick out some sounds like, oh, I know exactly what that sound is from. I know I've had this feeling a few times when watching other people's shows. So when you blend sounds together, it can make sounds that people haven't really heard before and make it sound unique in that way. Say, for example, Sonic is hit in the face with something wooden. Well, if I can't find a specific sound to match exactly this, most of the time I'll probably take a punch sound effect and a wood crunch sound effect and combine them both and have them play at once. The line that Sonic says at the start of this scene, now that we've got the scroll weapon we can beat Mega Turtle at the end of level 3, is a direct reference to the film The Wizard. I have never seen the entire movie, but it's such a I am playing a video game line of dialogue from the movie that I thought it'd be fun to include it. Speaking of Sonic playing the video game and of sound editing, actually, you can make out some sound effects from Sonic Heroes, Super Smash Bros. Brawl, Crash Bandicoot, and others through that game audio. And when Amy walks over to the door, you can hear the Mr. Yuji Naka is alright line of dialogue from Shadow the Hedgehog.
Although, the thing is, I'm really nervous about it all. But I heard that in these types of situations, it can work out really well if it's turned into a double date or something.
You want Sonic and me to double date with you and Blaze?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't mind.
That all sounds pretty good, just as long as you don't faint on us like you did on stage.
Hey, I had enough courage to ask her out in the first place, didn't I? And I didn't faint back there.
If you say so. But yeah, it does sound pretty fun, and if it'll make you less nervous, we'd be happy to help you out. Where's it at, anyway?
That one place in East Station Square, Greek Donald's was the name, I think.
Oh, perfect! That's Blaze's favorite place.
You want to meet there tomorrow, then? What's the time?
We should probably get there around noon. I'll let her know you guys will be joining us.
Yay, I'm so happy for you guys! I'm sure it's
That art in the background in the green rectangle behind Sonic is the art of one of my older fan character concepts by Wes, or Scrib, that won him the fan art contest that I mentioned earlier. I don't think I've mentioned it yet, but Silver appears so short in a lot of scenes because Jazzwares got the scaling of him wrong. I'm pretty sure they scaled his entire height from toe to tip of his hair that goes all the way up relative to other characters rather than scaling from around his face down and letting the top of his quill design extend further up. And when it comes to Blaze, she already looks like, I'm pretty sure they made her too tall. I know she's in heels, but still, she's like really, really tall. So in the scenes with Silver and Blaze next to each other, it looks ridiculous. Like, Silver looks so tiny and Blaze towers over him. The name of this restaurant is Threek Donald's, as in 3C and then Donald's. It's meant to be a play on how many anime series feature a McDonald's-like restaurant, but obviously cannot use the name, so they turned the M one direction, making WickDonald's or Eckdonald's. I hadn't ever seen it turned the other way into a 3, so that sort of stuck, and it became Threek Donald's. When recording the line with AJ, I hadn't made the set yet, so I was still, trying to come up with a name and finding something that sticks. In the 2017 blooper reel, you can hear him say the line with multiple different restaurant names, like Papa Goobies, Goobies Sandwiches and Stuff, Amires, and El Fuego. But the McDonald's bland name stuck, and that's what I went with. When I was designing the set, I was going for a more classic burger shop look, sort of similar to In-N-Out with the yellow and red color palette and tiled walls, or even classic McDonald's. I don't ever really go to the restaurant, so I often forget how modern and somewhat colorless, like, modern McDonald's look nowadays. It's kind of crazy. They look really futuristic. The window in the back was made from cutting a square-shaped hole in a cardboard plank for that wall, and then taping one of those transparent page protectors over it, covering the cardboard with the tiled paper design, and then it looks like a little window in the wall back there. It gives the set a lot of character, in my opinion, or at least more than it would have without the window, and you can even make some stuff out back there, like Big and the DeLorean. Even though Threek Donald's is a fast food restaurant, they have a waitstaff, seen here with Jack. Making him the waiter not only got rid of the problem of trying to fill that role with a random figure that might have not scaled with the other ones, but it also let me build a little more continuity between last episode and this one. In 21, it's said by Jack that they've been having trouble finding jobs because they're robots. After people saw the Radniks perform in the play, off-screen, of course, they warmed up to them, and Jack explains here that he was hired shortly after the play's premiere. I even have him hold the job for longer than this, and in the beginning of episode 24, he mentions getting home from a shift. After that, his job is not mentioned again, but I can confirm that Jack holds it for the rest of the series, and even after we see the show end. He's a hard worker. The tune Knuckles is whistling here is Cruel Angel's Thesis, the opening theme of Neon Genesis Evangelion. Since this episode has been out, there has been a consistent amount of comments from people saying how hard it is to listen to Silver's dialogue and that it's really cringy, and just saying how much of a jerk he is, which is obviously the point of this episode and how he's playing up this bad boy persona Vector tells him is going to work instead of just telling him to be himself, which was of course the point. I'll even admit myself, some of the lines that come out of his mouth are really hard to sit through, especially the line coming up where he suggests to Blaze to not only do something different with her hair, but to polish the gem on her forehead while she's at it. The latter half of that line was improvised by AJ, which, good on you, because that makes Silver really unlikable. Which was the point. The point is to take away from this is like, oh, I'm supposed to be myself in these situations. That's, it's a cliche message, but it's true.
I gotta go back to being a complete jerk.
No, Silver, don't you get it? This was just one of Vector's get-rich-quick schemes. Their advice isn't good for anything.
I don't know. You sure? Vector seemed pretty insistent with his advice. Plus, he's dated a whole 4 women.
Look, I'm telling you, you don't want to do that.
4 women, Sonic!
If you're wanting you and Blaze to actually become a thing, just be yourself. You don't have to put on some kind of ruse or anything. If she likes you, she'll like you for who you are.
You can never, ever take advice from anyone else.
Oh, that's right. Sorry, Sonic. No can do.
As I mentioned before, there was no fight scene in this episode, which gave me the opportunity to focus entirely on the dialogue the characters exchanged and build the central conflict out of that. Something I always look for in the things I watch, be it a movie or a show, or sometimes even video games, are good character interactions. And sometimes those can really make or break what you're experiencing. Here, there are a large amount of characters interacting with several others. Silver alone interacts with Shadow, Blaze, Vector, Amy, and Sonic, all in the span of this one episode. And then there are other ones like Sonic to Knuckles and Sonic to Amy, which are inherently different. I knew the characters would be sitting down for this scene since they're on a lunch double date and you don't stand for that, but actually getting them to sit down and work with them while seated was the bane of my existence, let me tell you. This extends to me building the table and chairs used here. I couldn't use actual miniature chairs for them because the backs of those chairs don't allow for, Silver and Sonic, they have quills extending far back on their heads, so normal chairs wouldn't work for them. So what I ended up doing is making a tiny, table and little bench-like chairs out of cardboard and putty to hold them together. Only thing is, the putty really stands out in the seams, and you can tell it's like thrown together. I don't know, I should have at least put paper over it or something to mask the putty. I've heard a lot of directors and DPs talking about how blocking and shooting dinner table scenes can be such a nightmare, and even on this small scale I was working with, I can really see that. Especially with how low the characters are, once the food is on the table, some of the shot composition becomes hindered as a result. I believe all the food on the table came from a Doraemon mystery box set of miniature food. You see things like burgers and chicken nuggets, hot dogs, macaroni, that kind of stuff. By the way, Sonic orders a hot dog, which, yes, in hindsight, he should have ordered a chili dog. I was aware of this at the time I made it, but I didn't have anything to represent chili on top of the hot dog. Honestly, I should have just had him say chili dog and not worried, because I don't think anyone would have cared. More people have pointed out that he should have said chili dog than I think people would have pointed out, like, hey, there's no chili on that dog. Silver scolds Blaze for seeming childish, but then orders a meal that comes with a toy, and you can actually see the toy on Silver's tray. It's the little green dog, which is none other than Chuck from Panty and Stocking with Garter Belt, which was included with one of the Nendoroids that I had at the time. Around episode 19 is when I made characters actually start walking by moving both of their legs. Wow, what a concept, instead of just sliding around on the ground. The shot back in episode 19 where Sonic steps away from the building was, I think, my first experience with that kind of thing. And timing it correctly and adding the appropriate sounds was, new as well. Speaking more to that, there is a shot that just passed with Silver walking back to the table, which was animated digitally, as you might be able to tell. I needed him to be talking while he did this, so I chose to not animate it in the traditional stop-motion style, since motion tracking a mouth on him doing so might have been difficult and looked strange, and I would have likely ran out of distance for him to walk and say these things the entire way before he reached the table again. The music used in this scene is a piece from Toradora called Sora Iro no Hokago, one of the more emotional pieces from the series. It was the first track I had in mind when it came to, using music for this scene. The only problem was it got copyright matched. Whenever I use songs like that I feel might have a strong possibility of getting copyright matched, I always do test uploads to see if it will match or not, and well, this one did. To get around it, I simply did the most basic thing and pitch shifted the music. And look, I don't like doing that. I will rarely do it. I think I might have done it one other time, if that. This might be the only time I did it. I hate doing it because I don't like altering how the piece sounds originally, especially in pitch. But the amount I changed the piece kept it sounding somewhat normal and was just enough to not get detected, so I decided to go with it.
We just stayed friends for now.
I see.
But you never know. Someday things can change. I'm gonna head back in now, but I'll be seeing you around, okay?
Sure. Later. Yeah.
In terms of the Silver and Blaze romance, I have it left up in the air at the end when, Blaze says it would be better if they just stay friends for right now, and maybe someday things could change. Other than a small scene with Silver next episode, it isn't ever mentioned again after this, up until them sharing a small scene in the series finale. I think it was best to leave it this way. The series might have slight romantic elements here and there, but it's not the focus, and it's definitely not the force that rules the series. So having this little slice of life episode feels like a nice kickback until things start to go awry in episode 23 and onwards. And this was the last episode I made while I was in high school. Now, it actually released after I graduated, about a month so, but a majority of it, I was working on it while I was in my last semester. I remember it being really rewarding to release this one because it came out right before I went on vacation, which included visiting New York City for the first time. At this point, I had gotten an actual job as well, and I was able to step away from both my job and my YouTube job and also school. So, to take a vacation, that was pretty dang nice. The song used in the credits here is an instrumental cover of Stay the Night by Green Day, done by a user named Rakuga Kicho. I thought it was sort of fitting since it was a fairly light episode in terms of tone and whatnot. I've been a Green Day fan for a majority of my life at this point. And being able to use a song in one of my videos at some point was kind of nice, even if it was from the trilogy, which is really hit and miss with a lot of people. Back in episode 20, I was talking about how I wanted to do a Sonic and Amy breakup episode. I had been planning on using a cover of the song Amy off of Dose, a cover of the song by a user named Hearts at War, who has covered a lot of Green Day songs in their as if they were released on Dookie, which is like one of their early records. But of course I never did that breakup episode, and at this point I probably realized I never was going to, so I figured, hey, might as well use Green Day somewhere.
If you're like me, then you're very particular about what kind of figure you have. Having trouble? Then stop by the Chaotix Weight Loss Clinic and Spa to receive advice from...
Episode 23, Knightmare. The time between episodes 22 and 23 was at the time my longest hiatus between episodes, and remains that way to this day, even beating the time between 25 and 26. That was about a year, whereas this break was 15 months. Now, I say in the description there were a couple contributing factors to this, one of which was I halted production. I think I got into, I shot and edited the first scene, but then I halted production to focus on the Sonic Historical Marathon, which was my celebration of Sonic's 25th anniversary. Another break was when I took about a week off from editing to focus on ripping and organizing the Sonic Adventure 2 sound effects, which, yeah, it actually did take that long. I needed to take a break from editing just to, sort these sound effects. But I'm actually glad I did that because I did use a fair amount in this episode. The editing for this one sticks out in my memory as the first time I started tinting and color correcting in the closest way that I would be doing it for the rest of the show. I made small changes and advancements later, but the overall process stayed pretty similar. One change was later switching to using the color balance tool instead of the color correction tool in Vegas, because the color correction tool is really extreme, but the color balance tool was a little more what I was going for and the purpose of color correcting in the first place. Because some of these shots, it looks strange in some of the colors, like on Knuckles, it doesn't look quite right, because I tried making it more blue with color correction, and it's not exactly right. Color balance would have made it look a lot better. And I now religiously started incorporating sharpening into the tinting process to make things much more crisp and nice looking. Just compare some of these shots to shots from episode 20. There's a shot back there with Sonic holding a copy of Madion's Adventure album, and I shot it by completely turning the set around and thinking it'd be nice to vary some angles, but in doing so, I actually break the 180-degree rule inadvertently, and it doesn't really look great as a result. I think this episode might have been the first one I shot with when I used a remote for my camera. The camera I used has a photo button on top, so when you press it, there's a very high risk you're bumping the camera and having it move, even a tiny bit out of frame so it looks like it's jittering. This was also true for all other cameras I used before the one I got, but you can watch episodes 19 through 21 specifically to see how the camera jitters around, and from this episode onward it stabilizes pretty drastically, because when you have a remote to take the pictures instead of touching the camera itself, you alleviate the risk of error. I remember uploading one episode, I think it might have been 21 or 22, suggesting getting a remote and shooting that way, and I literally saw that comment and then went to eBay to buy one, because I knew that the camera supported remotes and I knew about them, but I just hadn't ever got around to getting one. I suppose that comment was like, hey, yeah, you should do it, and then I did. In this episode, we of course see the return of Zalvandor, played by Gilnov once again. Revisiting him as a character was a blast in a lot of ways, getting to write his dialogue again and take his character in a different direction, having him eventually defect from Robotnik at the end of this episode. Gilnov did a fantastic job returning to the role as well. Working with Zalvandor as a figure, I remembered how difficult it was, so I sort of went in rather prepared this time around and tried to make it look a little better compared to how he moved in 19, and I think I did succeed, even though he's still a very limited figure. I made slight modifications to his visor as well, putting yellow construction paper on the sides and black paper underneath so you no longer see Sonic's face on the actual Excalibur Sonic figure, which is great because it looked goofy before. Robotnik is about to introduce Zerato, the robot of the week, in this episode. My original plan for how he would look and be as a character was much different. Recall in episode 19 when I mentioned how my original idea was that there were going to be two robots. There was going to be the Excalibur Sonic one, which was Zalvandor, and there was going to be the Lancelot Shadow one. I scrapped that idea, but when it came to introducing a new robot to go against Zalvandor here, I intended from the beginning to revive the inclusion of Lancelot Shadow and have Robotnik introduce him as the next installment of the Knightmare series of robots. He would have been named Zaven Raven Zaxanote, named in a very similar fashion to Zalvandor, with a long three-part name that begins with an X. His mannerisms and way of speaking was also originally intended to be a lot like Zalvandor. The rest of the story was pretty much the same from, how we see it now. So why didn't I go with the Lancelot? Well, Excalibur Sonic was hard enough to work with, but the Lancelot Shadow was a completely different story. It was practically impossible. I went as far as drilling holes in the head to try to make it not as top-heavy and easier to work with, but to no avail. I decided I needed to take things in a different direction, and the entire process is mirrored with Robotnik saying he was planning on continuing the Knightmare series, but scrapped it after seeing how Zalvandor failed, which I also think makes a lot of sense in the universe. I started looking for figures that could serve okay as a robot, even if they were from an established property. One of the contenders was actually a Red Ranger Figuarts from Power Rangers, but I'm glad I decided against that. I ended up going with the Figuarts Tiger from Tiger and Bunny, which might look strange if you know the show or, know the design. But I worked with what I had, and I thought for a one-time villain it would be fine. Working with these two figures was like night and day. Coincidentally, it shows the improvement Robotnik made between Zalvandor and making Zerato. The Excalibur Sonic figure was of course made by Jazzwares, and I've talked about some of the faults in their figures in the past. The Tiger figure was a Figuarts release through Bandai Tamashii Nations, and a lot of figure collectors are no doubt familiar with the brand. I personally used to get a lot of their releases, like all the Dragon Ball Figuarts and Mega Man D-Arts, stuff like that. The Zero of which actually appears in episode 17. Their range of movement and overall quality is on a completely different level. The Jazzwares line were store-bought figures intended mostly for kids, but, the collector aspect came after that. Whereas the Bandai Tamashii figures are meant more for collectors from the get-go. Tiger was a joy to work with and was super smooth and didn't have many problems standing up. It was awesome.
You see? That's how it's done. By a landslide, the winner is Zerato!
Upon watching this episode again, I realized a slight parallel between Sonic and Salvador in that Sonic loses the first round and then wins the second in episode 19, and Salvador loses here to Zerato and then technically kind of wins later, even though he's not the one to actually defeat Zerato. I knew I needed a dumpster for this scene, and I had been keeping an eye out online for ones, but I was coming across ones that were either way too small or way too expensive for only like one scene in the show. So I ended up making one from scratch with cardboard and construction paper. I still think it came out looking pretty dang good. You know, the logos and the warnings on the front of it make it look very official. The Egg Robo grabbing the guitar was meant as a little nod to how he gave Robotnik a drum roll in episode 20 and how he just might like music a little bit. This interior shot was not actually shot inside the dumpster at all. It's just one frame that I think I might have taken on my desk in my room. It's just dismantled Salvador surrounded by a bunch of cardboard and scraps, and then I probably just held a flashlight above it to get the light. I thought Silver might be the kind of guy to accept what Blaze says at the end of last episode, but then really, you know, be too much in his head about it and overthink things, so I had this little bit where he's talking to Tails about it all and spilling it all out. When Sonic comes in and sees Silver is still talking about it, he says, "Ugh, are you still on that?" I had written in a very early draft him saying, "Ugh, are you still on that? It's so last episode, dude, just let it go." And I'm so glad I cut that, the latter part of that line, because, you know, fourth wall breaks, my show had kind of outgrown at this point, so yeah, that had no place being here. This note leaving is of course a direct parallel to the wedding invitation that showed up on Tails' door back in episode 19, and we can see that Salvador likes to communicate through written message quite a bit. It's funny to know that technically he could have just gone to Sonic and said, "Hey, come help me or else the town's gonna die," but of course there's no suspense to that, so it's kept unknown to the gang who left the note in the first place. Take note of how at the beginning of this episode, Sonic threw away the sword that Salvador gave him last time. Back when Zaven was still in the picture instead of Zerato, I of course had him use swordplay just like Salvador does. And in that drafted idea, I had Salvador be thrown into the same dumpster that Sonic threw all his trash in, including the sword, which Salvador would then find after being thrown in it, and then leave it on Sonic's doorstep with a note that, you know, Sonic does get. He does get the note, but I was even going to have a scene with Sonic, like, stumbling upon it. When I changed to Zerato, he doesn't use swordplay, so I didn't think it was necessary to the plot. Also, swordplay was a little fun to, you know, work with, but I was completely fine with not revisiting it. Zerato is voiced by none other than my good friend Patrick, also known as the Sonic Merch Lore University graduate Pat Mac. Check out his YouTube videos if you haven't before. Right around this time I was looking for a voice for Zerato, and I really didn't know who I was going to get to do it. And that's when he did his voice reveal and started doing videos with actual talking instead of text. I took that video and pitch shifted some of the audio down and found that it kind of worked pretty well, so I got him on board for the project. I didn't explore it as much as I might have liked to, but having Salvador turn on Robotnik was really great and seemed like a natural direction to take his character after he was basically disowned and literally thrown out with the trash by Robotnik. At the end of the episode, he even tips the Chaotix off to where his base is, which leads to one of the biggest developments of the entire season, which is Robotnik getting permanently jailed. If I had gone in a direction that involved keeping Salvador around for the story, I might have perhaps had him dealing with some internal struggle of feeling guilt, you know, over jailing his creator, because even though he turns on him, he might still have feelings for, you know, he was basically his father. But at the end of this episode, he kind of... It's alluded to here and in the last episode where we see him again, where he is kind of a loner traveling the land between now and then. The dynamic between Sonic and Salvador in having them work together was a nice change of pace, certainly in comparing their interactions between episode 19. There's resentment on both sides, but they work together because they both have something at stake. You know, for Sonic, it's the obvious external threat of Robotnik trying to take the city over through Zerato. But for Salvador, it's an internal conflict of wanting to beat the thing that replaced him and sort of prove his worth. And he seeks help in the form of Sonic since he understands Sonic's power in an objective way, even if he doesn't like him.
Never going to let that go, are you?
What? Really?
But it turns out he wants this thing done for just as much as we do. Looks like the fight's about to break out. Talk to you soon, buddy. Alright, Sally Caliber, looks like we're working together on this one, but this is a one-time thing, you hear me?
Blaring and fair.
I don't have all day. There's a city hall that needs to be overthrown. Hurry this up if you can.
You heard him. Let's give him what he wants. Sonic win! You sure don't seem that tough.
Call this a warm-up.
Could use some help here.
Axis lightning!
That shot of Sonic being held up and repeatedly punched by Zerato was a little tricky to pull off because Sonic was actually connected to the figure's hand, like with mounting putty. That was a lot of weight to be constantly held up with only the figure's arm, but somehow it managed, and I think it came out looking pretty dang nice. When Zalvandor uses Axis Lightning back there, I used a new effect that I had made myself, and it marks the very first instance I used Adobe After Effects in my show. And one of the only times also. The only other instance that comes to mind when I used After Effects was creating the particle auras for the super forms and the hyper form in the series finale. One reason I involved the Chaotix a great deal in this episode was because I was setting up for an episode that was supposed to come between this and 24, but ended up being completely scrapped. I'll talk more about that in the next episode.
There's something happening right now that you guys might be interested in.
It's Tails. I'll put him on speaker.
Tails, buddy, what's up?
One of Eggman's machines is trying to get into City Hall and take over the city.
What?
You serious?
Yeah, Sonic's fighting with it right now, but Knuckles told me you were trying to get a better deal with the city. I'm sure if you showed some evidence that Eggman is behind all of this, like, oh, I don't know, a destroyed robot, that wouldn't be a problem.
Oh, Tails, you're a lifesaver. Come on, boys, let's get a move on. This could mean big money for us.
Hello?
Axis lightning!
Well, there's no denying you had potential to be great.
Cease your yammering!
But you're outdated and well past your prime. Just give up.
Coming up right here, I have Zerato rip off Zalvandor's arm, and that marks the permanent loss of it. You know, back in 19, Sonic cuts off the same arm with the sword he was using, but he was... Zalvandor was repaired by Robotnik afterwards, which included the arm, of course. Here I wanted to illustrate that it would have been much harder to repair, as Zerato haphazardly rips it off and then destroys it further by ripping it in half. And then, of course, Zalvandor doesn't exactly have anyone to turn to after this. He can't go to Robotnik to repair him, because he's had his tie severed, and Tails... You know, he wouldn't have any reason to repair Zalvandor. He's still considered a threat to the gang. But he does eventually get a replacement arm, as shown in the series finale, which coincidentally is the Lancelot shadow figure, the thing that was originally supposed to be the conflict in this episode. The thing that would have torn his arm off. Some nice pictures on the set here. You can see the Boston self-titled cover art, the Emotional Roadshow, 21 Pilots tour poster, and some art from Super, even the Sonic Historical Marathon logo. This marks the first appearance of Supersonic in a very long time. Obviously not counting Dark Sonic or Mock Supersonic. We haven't seen Sonic completely go super since Timeline Paradox, which isn't canon, so this is actually the first time Sonic goes super canonly in the show. And if on your first viewing of this you thought this was an incredibly short appearance of him doing so, well, I can say that that was completely intentional. I wanted to give a very small tease of what Supersonic was capable of by destroying this pretty powerful robot in one easy swoosh, and then immediately turning back into his base form. Sonic goes super again next episode, but the actual payoff of the form doesn't come until 26 when he goes up against Bedlam. Another reason it was very short is that here he already can't hold the form for very long, which is talked about more next episode. The music used when he transforms is a cover of Open Your Heart done by Jonathan Parecki, the same beautiful man that performed the cover of Live and Learn that you hear in the opening of Season 3. The lines between Vector and Knuckles when they say, "So that's supersonic," was a nice way of me sneaking in an in-joke between me and AJ. In Sonic Adventure 2, when you beat both the Hero and the Dark stories, you are presented with a trailer for the last story, which features all the characters saying a bunch of things at the same time, with text accompanied on screen. Well, since these voice files have been ripped for quite a while, we have access to each one individually, and we got a kick out of Knuckles saying supersonic, which is one of the ones that appears in the trailers, so I thought it'd be a nice little slide at that in-joke, but you know, it's something that's so subtle you probably didn't even know it was a reference to anything, which is good. That's how some references should be. Here I tease a rematch between Sonic and Salvador with them saying they're going to settle the score next time for good. But just like the rematch between Sonic and Shadow that was teased back in episode 20, it never happens. Unlike that Sonic and Shadow one, though, I think at the time I knew I wasn't going to have a rematch between Sonic and Salvador because the remainder of the story didn't at all call for it. Maybe sometime after the story that we see, you know, after the credits roll in the final episode, the rematch does happen at some point, but we just don't see it. This episode ends on an ominous cliffhanger that, of course, sets up the next episode with things going wrong with the emeralds and nice stuff from there. The post-credits scene that's coming is probably my favorite post-credits that I've done, mainly because it's so important to the story. Whenever I did after-credit scenes, they tended to be things you could go on without seeing, mostly little jokes that carried from the other parts of the episode, because I know that once the credits pop up, so many people click off, which it does irritate me to an extent, but I get it. I'll readily admit that I don't sit through all of the credits of every movie I see, and even though Marvel has popularized having things at the end of credits, not many others do it very often. For this one, though, Robotnik getting jailed is extremely important to the plot as it solidifies his location and amount of involvement he would have for the rest of the show. Finally jailing him in my show was also a way to force myself to rely on the conflict not coming from him directly and move forward with the plan to introduce Bedlam. Some people were expecting him to break out of the prison at some point, but I never had any plans for that to happen. Once he's in prison, that is it. Sayonara, Eggman. 25 to life. I'm still so satisfied with the shot at the end here with Espio saying Eggman Empire, yeah right, and then throwing the dynamite into his base, followed by the door closing. Well, the Egg Robo is actually left on the floor here, so all we can assume is that this is the end for the poor little guy. All he wanted to do was serve Robotnik and play the drums, but sometimes it's just gotta be like that.
You really think Zerato was a good name for that robot? Hey, lay off. It sounds cool, doesn't it?
Freeze, Robotnik! We have a warrant for your arrest issued by the city of Station Square.
Yeah. So anyway, What?
We went to the city with evidence that you were trying to take it over. Turns out Sonic's wrist device was recording the whole exchange he had with your little toy. That made it pretty easy.
But how did you find me? Oh yeah, that reminds me. Salvador says hi. Salvador? Oh, that worthless traitor!
Are we going to do this the easy way or the hard way? Your choice, Doctor.
Robo, get them now! Aye, sir.
Hard way it is. That's fine. It's really just more fun for us anyway. Alright, old man. You're coming with us.
No, you can't take me! This isn't fair! Long live the Eggman Empire!
Eggman Empire? Yeah, right.
Episode 24, Chaos Buffer. Let me start by talking about the scrapped version of episode 24, meaning that the one that we're seeing now was going to be 25 and the series finale would have been episode 28. Let's refer to it as Scrapped 24. Scrapped 24 was going to take one final slice of life approach to the series and focus a lot on Vector as the main character, with Knuckles, Espio, and Dash as main supporting and the rest of the gang as minor supporting. Actually, there was going to be one other character as part of the main supporting cast, which was a brand new one I plan to introduce, in that of Vector's dad, who I named Gregorio. The plot of the episode would have opened in an almost identical way to how it does here in the real 24, with Jack returning to the Radnick apartment with a Chaos Emerald. The Emerald would have made Dash short out, but instead of attacking Knuckles in Shadow, he would have malfunctioned and basically the robot version of sleepwalked into town and broken into a store, and then would have ended up getting arrested. The next scene would have been Gregorio showing up to the Chaotix office and talking with Vector about how he should stop doing childish detective work and continue in the family business of being a lawyer, and it would have been revealed that Vector dropped out of law school years ago. I either had him be called in as a juror, or he would have just heard about the trial and wanted to see it, but Robotnik's trial following his arrest in episode 23 would have been happening in the background. Anyway, the episode would have eventually led to Dash getting trial by jury, but receiving a lot of prejudice because they just sentenced, his creator to prison, and he's a robot. The episode would have seen Vector choose to represent Dash as a favor to him and to prove to his dad that he could be a lawyer, but didn't go into that line of business because he didn't enjoy it. He would have won the case, Dash would have not been sentenced, and Gregorio would be accepting of his son, and then he would have left, just as mysteriously as he appeared. So, why did I not go through with this idea? Well, it's in large part due to the feedback I got from episode 23. I had started writing the script for what is now the scrapped 24, but since I ended 23 on a cliffhanger, so many people were commenting that they couldn't wait to see what happened next, and that questions about the emeralds and stuff would be answered in next episode. Let me be clear in stating that I truly believe in the scrapped 24's plot that I just described. I didn't scrap it because I lost interest in doing the idea or thought it wouldn't work, and even though that whole idea with Vector's dad and the lawyer aspect of it, it sounds funny, but it's something I would have played straight. And I would have given the episode two messages. One, to let your children lead their own lives and not pigeonhole them into what you wanted them to do. And two, to not judge others based on appearance or other prejudices, like so many of the jury were with Dash. Going back to what I was saying with 23, the more and more comments I saw looking forward to the next episode to get some answers, the more it seemed like it just wasn't the right time to do Scrapped 24. And that it would have felt like I built up a lot in 23, and then had it sort of dip and take a break in overall tension in the next one. While the Emerald conflict would have been involved, it would have definitely been in the background of the main conflict with Vector and Dash. So I decided to skip it altogether and move on to the real episode 24, Chaos Buffer, and I never really came up with a good name for Scrapped 24 either. Like, Vector, the Crocodile Attorney at Law is one, but that felt so easy and cheap to do, and I didn't want to do that. However, if anyone nowadays would have wanted to see Scrapped 24, it would be pretty tricky, because Scrapped 24 and Real 24 cannot coexist. It's not as simple as the Vector episode would have, come after 23, but before this 24, and we just don't see it. It's more that the episode we're seeing now, I took remnants of Scrapped 24 and incorporated them here. The episode after Scrapped 24 was going to focus on strange happenings with the emeralds and things that they'd been causing, but I didn't have enough to make an entire episode out of it. So scrapping Scrapped 24 actually worked to my advantage. For example, Scrapped 24 would have opened with the Radnicks, like I previously said. The scene that takes place after, in Chaos Buffer, involves Knuckles and Shadow feeling a chaos signal. That scene was originally intended to be the post-credit scene of Scrapped 24, with the last line of the episode being Shadow saying it felt like a warning. As you can see in the real 24, I combined the aspects of Dash shorting out because of the Emerald and the chaos signal being felt by Knuckles and Shadow into one scene. Overall, I'm happy with the way I did things, and while I still feel like Scrapped 24 had some overall great material, the timing just did not work to its advantage, especially since I had really started to build towards what would become the final arc of the show. It would have been like taking one step forward, but 2 steps back. Oh, at least temporarily. I even started to set up the Vector situation back in 23, where Knuckles says it's been slow and Vector's trying to get a better deal with the city. That's the purpose of him saying that, is because the next one was going to focus on Vector, but now it just feels like fluff dialogue. Saying that just reminded me that the Chaotix would have moved to a much larger office in Scrapped 24, as they did end up getting a better deal with the city after successfully arresting Robotnik. In terms of how I would have made Vector's dad look, I would have taken a slightly more simple and sort of comedic approach and just slapped a mustache and big eyebrows on another Vector figure, and then added a pair of glasses and a tie as the cherries on top. Even though they passed, I do want to talk about the previous two scenes, starting with the Radnick apartment. If you look, they actually do have more furniture and art hung up on the walls now, which was an easy way of me showing that they've lived there for a while and they're able to afford such things. As for the Knuckles and Shadow scene that follows, I really like how it came out. I hadn't ever done any scenes at night, as in like taking place at nighttime in-universe, so it was a nice change of pace when it came to lighting it. The main light source was just one of the lamps I had used before, but with the exposure on my camera turned way down, and then I shot in a different white balance than normal. I think I might have also placed like really thin blue like gift tissue paper over the light. I know I bought it to see if it would work, but I can't remember if I ended up using it or not. I do remember I didn't have to alter it to look like very blue, because the raw shots from my camera just kind of came out looking like that. But I think what might have happened is I tried using the tissue paper, but it got rid of the light too much, or something like that. It's hard to remember. But then I took a string of small Christmas lights and stuck them through the walls in the back, but they didn't come out as bright as I had intended them to. This episode and the next are some of the only nods to Knuckles' backstory I give, and barely even mention the Master Emerald at all, which leads to the question of what's going on with the Master Emerald during all of this Chaos Emerald chaos. We never see it in my show. Around this time, I was thinking of explaining why Knuckles doesn't guard it, one of the ideas being that he had a security system set up on Angel Island, but that's just kind of stupid, honestly. If I had to give an actual reason, I would say that the Master Emerald is simply dormant in my series and doesn't give off the energy that it once did, maybe as a sort of natural state for it. I was talking with David about this, and really it's just that the Master Emerald doesn't matter in my show. I don't ever explore it because it's not something I needed or wanted to. Here we have more teases of Supersonic, and the shot where he transforms is actually, the way it zooms down on him is actually a slight reference to the opening shot of the opening, where it kind of zooms down on Sonic in a very similar way. For Superform characters, there are two versions of the auras in my show, the normal particle aura and what I call the burst aura. The particle aura is a simple effect that I made myself in After Effects, which is on the character at all times when they're super. I wanted the Superforms to have an added level of spectacle, so I made it that it never turns off. It's kind of glittery and shiny in that way. The burst aura is only seen when the characters first transform or when they power up. It involves more energy, and you can see the effects transition from the burst aura to the particle effect, or to the particle aura rather, when Sonic says, "I think so," right before losing his transformation. The burst aura is made up of 3 effects, one of which is the same particle aura that's on at all times, and then 2 aura effect presets made by a man named Gil Hermy, also known as Zilidus, who ended up helping David out with effects in Super Saiyans vs. Super Hedgehogs 2. When it comes to layering all of them, one of the presets is behind Supersonic, the other is on top, and then finally the particle effect is on top of that. The auras for Supersonic, Super Shadow, and Frantic Bedlam later on are all made from these 3 effects, just changed in color to match who they're on. Sonic and Shadow obviously have very similar looking ones, just in different shades of yellow, Sonic having more of a standard gold-colored aura, and Shadow having a lighter, kind of creamy yellow color to the aura, both of which, of course, match their fur color in their super forms. And then Bedlam's is somewhere between hot pink and bright purple with some red in there, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. By the way, that shot where Sonic loses his super form, you can see the red Chaos Emerald bounce off of an abandoned building, which later collapses as a result. Written on one of the boards over the entrance, you can see the Twitter handle of Jake Williams, or the Twitter handle is, I think, Dat Jake Williams, who runs the channel Bright Sun Films, home to a series called Abandoned. I added it as a tiny reference to that since it's an abandoned building. I forgot to mention how this episode features a modified version of the opening, featuring new shots of the Chaotix, Knuckles, and Shadow, and one that parallels Sonic and Bedlam before Bedlam's revealed at the end of this. The hand that Sonic holds up in that shot is actually the hand that would receive the mark of the moderator symbol. I wish I could say that I had the foresight and knew exactly that that's what I was going to do, but I did not at the time. Bedlam's silhouette also appears in the flashing of characters towards the end of the opening, as does the mark of the moderator in the middle of the emeralds.
I'm sure he could use a hand. Let's get the emeralds and follow him. You got it. The ultimate power. Wait, what?
This Knightmare sequence was really great to put together, with being able to foreshadow what was to come. The emeralds losing their color was not meant to signify them losing their power, but rather the gang being unable to utilize it going forward. And then of course Bedlam's eye symbol appearing, which we later learn is the mark of the moderator. All the frames of Sonic are PNGs without a background, so it's just the default black, and then he has a simple outer glow effect added. I still personally think this is one of the best scenes I've worked on in terms of sound design, because I really wanted to make it feel somewhat otherworldly and more like a loose version of reality that you sometimes experience in dreams. You know, having this sort of ominous ambience throughout really brought that out in the scene. My favorite part is when everything starts to get very loud shortly before Sonic wakes up. You know how when you're dreaming sometimes and there's like sounds happening around you, maybe it's an alarm clock or something, that sound can kind of make its way into your dream somehow in some form? Well, there's a sound that sounds a little bit like an ambulance siren right at the end of the sequence, but it's actually a slowed down version of the phone ringing sound effect, which is what wakes Sonic up. There is a specific sound effect I used a lot in this episode in particular. It's kind of like a droning, like, I don't know how to describe it other than that. I wanted it to be sort of like this warning sound that played whenever something involving the emeralds or Bedlam happened. You can hear it when Sonic and Shadow transform in this episode, when Sonic appears in his Knightmare sequence, and a few times in the final scene right before Bedlam shows up. This news sequence features voice cameos from Emmy Jones and Sonic Pox as the two eyewitnesses, and none other than Moshe as the news announcer. The news keeps running in the background as Sonic talks to Tails on the phone, so I did actually write out an entire line for the news, which you can hear uninterrupted in the 2017 outtake reel. I wrote in a slight jab at AJ for still not finishing and uploading episode 11 of Speed Stories, and this was also around the time that the SH Figuarts Gotenks figure got announced, so I wrote in Moshe saying, "Tamashii Nations is finally making an SH Figuarts Gotenks figure. This can be considered a victory for all." This was back when I avidly collected the Dragon Ball Figuarts line, and Gotenks was one of those Grail figures that I really wanted them to make, and almost 2 years later, I've sold off pretty much all my Dragon Ball figures, but I did finally get Gotenks, which at the time of me recording this is about a foot away from my microphone. He's sitting right here on my desk. He's actually dabbing, just I thought I'd let you know. The line of Sonic saying, "Do you think it could be," and then Tails cuts him off. The full line of what Sonic was going to say is, "Do you think this could be Robotnik?" Just to clear up any confusion that might have caused. Also, at the end of the jail scene later is one of the few times Sonic calls Robotnik Eggman in my show, although last episode almost every time Robotnik is referred to by another character, they call him Eggman. There wasn't really any planned significance in this. I think it mostly came from me warming up to the name after so long of a time of me sticking solely to calling him Robotnik. But I think if I were to go back and change some things, I'd probably make it more consistently Robotnik, and only have him referred to as Eggman if there was more of a reason for it. The voice that says, "Robotnik, you've got a visitor," is none other than Alexander the Swell, making a voice cameo. I'm happy that I can now call him one of my friends, and that I was able to work with him in this very small part in my show, because he is one of the people that served as like a huge inspiration for SSMA. I remember making my YouTube account just so I could subscribe to him back when he did like Sonic figure reviews and collection videos in a completely different account. But he also did a little bit of stop motion, which as I'm sure you can guess was where I was inspired most. Around this time, I started to realize how great the Shadow the Hedgehog soundtrack was, so I started using tracks from it quite a bit because it fit a lot of scenes. Like, I was kind of surprised. Like, it almost turned into, well, nothing is really sticking for this scene, so something from Shadow the Hedgehog is certain to work.
What on earth are you talking about? Don't play dumb, I know you're behind this all somehow. Excuse me, but I implore you to take a look at where I'm standing. It's a jail cell, Sonic. I can't exactly do much while I'm in here, especially if it has to do with the outside world. I thought you were at least smart enough to grasp it.
This is a very exposition-heavy episode, and that's one of the criticisms it received upon release. And while I do, for the most part, stand behind a lot of this episode, it's true that in some areas I do a lot more telling instead of showing, which is, it's a film rule that I believe is really important, but I went against it. I think this was the best I could do given my circumstances and how I wanted to introduce Bedlam at the end of this episode. Keep in mind there was an entire episode that I cut that was supposed to take place between, 23 and Chaos Buffer. And even though the conflict with the emeralds would have been in the background, it still would have been present and hinted at further. So when I scrapped that episode and moved on to this one, I was sort of like, okay, now it's time to introduce Bedlam, and ended up making it a lot of exposition. If I were to go back and change how things were done, I would have started to drop more hints in episode 23 about the coming conflict, and would have done it in a more of a show, don't tell kind of fashion. It's very much a setup episode, and maybe that is one of the reasons it's sort of a black sheep compared to the rest of Season 3 in terms of views, and has some of the least amount of views in all of Season 3. If I had to pick an episode to have the least amount of views in Season 3, this one makes sense. Maybe I would have picked 22, but I understand it. I'm not, I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't dislike this episode, but I can see why it could have the least amount of views. Even though it's not like you know what the episode is about before you click on it, but I'm getting too deep. This scene with Sonic and Robotnik is far and away the best scene of the episode. Having the two converse in a somewhat equal setting was really refreshing. These two were always fighting in my show, and in the games for that matter, so we didn't really get scenes like this before. Also, from a technical standpoint, having the scene this long where it's only me talking to myself back and forth was more fun than it sounds. Even though I did sessions with a good number of my voice actors, I wasn't recording my lines alongside theirs, so I didn't really get to play off of them like that. Here, however, I was kind of able to play off myself, voicing both Sonic and Robotnik. Therefore, I had more control on the scene overall, and was able to get a lot of the delivery really right. When Robotnik starts talking about how using the emeralds can be detrimental, I wanted to convey that he could, at this point, be starting to piece together what's happening to an extent. I mean, if you think about it, Robotnik's supposed to be a genuinely smart character, so if he was tipped off to some of the things that are going on, and then filled in by Sonic what has happened to him and his friends personally, I think it makes sense for him to come to a somewhat accurate conclusion. And it, of course, serves the episode well because it's more set up for Bedlam, while the audience is still experiencing a lot of tension and mystery. He does not know about Bedlam, though, which keeps the mystery element while still providing some possible answers to Sonic and to the audience. When it came to making the jail cell bars, I concluded that the best way to do so would be making them from these very tall 2x1 Lego bricks. It was, it immediately made it uniform, so it made all the bars look exactly alike, which was what I wanted. I got them through the LEGO official Pick-a-Brick service, which lets you do as advertised, pick individual brick types, and, buy just those. I can't remember how many I ordered, but I want to say it was around 33. So the total after shipping was something like $16, which in the grand scheme of things isn't really that bad at all. I knew the set would be revisited too, so I'd say I got my money's worth out of them. Each cell bar is made from, I believe, 3 of the pieces stacked on top of each other and then mounted to a plank of cardboard that is just out of frame above. It was a bit of a balancing act getting them to stay up without slanting too much, but luckily it worked out in the end. I originally wanted his cell to be a corner unit, so it would have had more bars going the opposite way, but it kind of complicated things too much, and especially in terms of like getting angles in that set. I made the bars in a way that they could be moved around however for me to get pretty much any angle I wanted to.
Remember, the emeralds themselves are full of mystery. The power they offer is one thing, but no one really knows the full story behind them. It's entirely possible that we were never meant to find them at all. Alright. I guess I'm done here then. If you're not behind it, then I really don't know what's up with them at all. A small part of me wishes that you were, just so this would all be more simple. I wish that too, but probably for different reasons. In that case, I'll see you around then. I've got somewhere to be. Whatever happens, do me one favor. What's that? Try not to get yourself killed before I get out of here. I'd like to have the honor of doing you in myself. I doubt you'd ever be able to, but I can assure you that I'll still be alive and kicking to put you in your place again, whenever that'll be. Later, Eggman. Good luck out there, Sonic. It sounds like you might need it.
Okay, Tails. That's the last one.
You've got all the emeralds set up? Great. The program's booting up right now. After that, we can get rolling.
Hey, Tails, you never did explain what exactly this thing is supposed to do.
Oh, right. I've named this the Emerald Energy Manager, or EEM for short. Inside the program, I have the data that correlates how much output the emeralds had before they started going haywire. This machine that's linked to it is designed to return their output levels to how they were by forcing out any excess energy that might be in the emeralds. In other words, it's designed to return them to their natural state, and in turn, this will stop the strange happenings that the emeralds have been causing. Hopefully, anyway.
I've gotta say, it's impressive that you'd be able to build something capable of doing that. It is capable of doing that, right?
That's what I shot for, after all. Hard to tell for sure, since I haven't made anything like this before, but we don't have any other options, so it's worth a shot. Time to throw caution to the wind.
We're not waiting for Sonic?
He'll get here when he gets here. I don't want to wait any longer. I'm anxious enough as it is to see if it's going to work.
Hey, this might be a bad time to mention this, but, are you guys feeling that?
Yeah, it feels almost magnetic in a way. But not like it's drawing us closer to the emeralds, more like it's pushing us away.
All the more reason to start. Are you guys ready?
The blocks that the emeralds sit on in this scene are simple wooden cubes that I picked up from Michael's and then bore little holes in on the top to make them be able to physically hold the emeralds. When it came to making the EEM, the base of it was some kind of charging part or power supply to something. I honestly can't remember because it feels like I've had that thing forever. You can actually see the piece in like other sets before it was turned into the EEM in other episodes. I printed out some designs to act as decals on the machine and glued some wires on top and with some lights, and bada bing, bada boom, you got yourself a little machine. There is no action scene in this episode, and if I'm remembering correctly, it's when my animation started improving a lot, more in terms of both quantity and quality. Since it's, a lot of scenes of simply characters talking to one another, I had to make it look visually interesting, so characters were moving around a lot more now. Putting together this sequence where the EEM is activated and Bedlam finally appears was super fun. This was like the most fun I had making this episode. I wanted to build a sense of danger, but also desperation, with Tails feeling like they have to go through with this, even though with the earth shaking and lightning strikes happening. Fun fact, the lightning strikes are the same effect as Zalvandor's Axis Lightning from last episode, just colored differently. In terms of introducing Bedlam, I knew that it was going to turn some heads, especially since he appears at the end of the episode. Fan-created characters already don't have a great reputation and get joked on really hard in the Sonic community. Like I've said before, even though other communities have similar traits, it's the Sonic franchise that really gets slammed for the same stuff for one reason or another. So I knew in that way the audience was sort of against me from the beginning and I'd have to win them over with the character of Bedlam. Only problem was I wasn't going to be able to truly do that until next episode. And, you know, finishing an episode, usually it's not like I'm working on the next one, so it would be a while before Bedlam got his proper introduction. And of course, upon his reveal, the OC jokes came left and right, but I did expect it. There were some people, though, that were guessing that he was Nazo or Infinite, which I get to an extent, but really they all look so different from each other, especially Infinite, which is a radically different design compared to Bedlam. But again, I kind of get this, because Infinite was revealed shortly before this episode was released, and the excitement for Sonic Forces had been building. Obviously, I knew what I was doing here from the time I started writing the episode, so once Infinite got officially revealed, I was like, oh no, here we go. It's going to be a whole thing when I try to introduce Bedlam. It was a conscious decision not to reveal his name. It's not that I hadn't decided on a name yet, but rather I knew it would be more suspenseful and more of a payoff if I waited until next episode to reveal it, and it's also, of course, in the episode's name. It's much better than just throwing it into the credits with no one having said it, and it's like, wait, Bedlam? Oh, Bedlam, that was his name. You know, it's so anticlimactic. Episode 25, Call Me Bedlam. Since this takes place right after the events of episode 24, I recut the final scene of it to serve as an extended cold open here. When the season uploads go up, you can expect to see 24 bleed right into 25 with no credits. This was a huge episode for the series and really served as the turning point in a way, because while Bedlam got his stinger introduction last episode, this is the one where we learn what he's all about, why he appeared, his connections to the Emeralds, and so on. We are now officially in the last arc of the show, the Bedlam arc. At the end of the opening now, Bedlam is no longer a silhouette. This title card coming up, I think, is still some of my best work. I'm really happy with how it came out in terms of the poses and the coloring. I think as far as my drawing skills go with the title cards, it peaked here and stayed consistent with the next two title cards, which is kind of nice to have them look so uniform. When I was putting together prints to sell at Sonic Revolution 2017, this title card was one of them, just without the episode name on it, as I was still keeping Bedlam's name a mystery. Funny story about that is that Aaron Weber showed up later in the day, and you know, a lot of people were talking to him. A lot of the guests that had brought art and prints for sale ended up, you know, giving him some, including me. And when I gave him a handful of the ones including Bedlam, I said that, oh, this is my own character. And then he was like, oh, cool, what's his name? And I had to be the guy to look Aaron Weber straight in the face and say, I can't tell you, it's a secret. Honestly, I probably could have told him, because it's not like he would have actually told anyone, or that he would have even mattered to him at all. It probably would have just been another word he heard that day. But, you know, that goes to show how serious I was about keeping his name under wraps. Another funny story about his name is that I was sharing some art of him in my Discord server prior to it being revealed, and at the time I was fairly new to Discord and forgot that when you post images it shows what the file name is, so I think only Patrick and Max saw it, but no one else did really. Introducing Bedlam was one of, if not the biggest event in my series, and I was ecstatic to finally reveal him in all his glory. Bedlam, the figure, was made by Wake Angel 2001, who has built up quite the reputation for customizing figures in general, but especially Sonic characters using the Jazzwares figures. He also, of course, made Frantic Bedlam, which will debut in the next episode. The figures came out looking so nice. He did such a great job on them. The slight paint chipping is just a result of moving the joints here and there, but I've actually had these customized figures for a long time. I think I got them back in like 2014. And the story of Bedlam's creation actually goes back further than that. I'm going to have a whole section on him in the upcoming documentary, but to summarize, he started out as a random sketch I did in freshman year, which later AJ and I tried working into the crossover we had planned. That eventually fell through, but I still, you know, liked the design and took him for myself, because he was my design in the first place, and I ended up getting figures made of him. after revising the design a lot. So that means the first iteration of what would become Bedlam goes all the way back to 2012. Even back then, when we eventually tossed out what we had for the crossover, I was seeing this character as the final conflict for my series. I didn't yet have the whole moderator backstory fleshed out, but I knew it was going to involve the Emeralds quite heavily. Along with him being the moderator of the Chaos Emeralds, some concepts I had played around with were him being a physical being created by the Emeralds themselves, or even him being the creator of the Chaos Emeralds. The moderator concept was, of course, the one that stuck, and it was always the one I was most partial to, so, of course, that's what I went with. A lot of this episode is exposition and explaining Bedlam's purpose, his reason for appearing and so on. Rewatching it now, it's a little much, kind of exposition heavy, similar to the last episode. I was still trying to get that balance right, and I'd say I still kind of am to this day. I was still fleshing everything out at the time I made this, but I never intended for Bedlam to be a villain for the sake of him being a villain. As his story stands in the final product, he's a guy that's just trying to do his job and maybe takes it too far. That makes him the antagonist by circumstance, not because he just wants to kill Sonic and take over the world, like Robotnik or something. Because I was still getting his story set up, he appears like a somewhat more typical edgy villain here, but that only serves to subvert your expectations in the next two episodes, the first of which opens with him being a normal guy, but I'll get to that scene next episode. It was important to establish him having it out for both Sonic and Robotnik, since they're both, they both use the Chaos Emeralds quite a lot. And it also shows that he isn't here to just kill the quote-unquote good guy. It kind of also goes along with the slight cliche in Sonic games of having Sonic and Robotnik team up at the end, but it's true that Bedlam was a bigger force than both of them. And Robotnik doesn't really team up with Sonic, he does all he can, but again, I'll get there when I get there. Two voice cameos here, Baylina Productions over the intercom and Steven Nux serving as an off-screen prison guard. I knew I was coming up on the end of my series, so when it came to little voices on the side like that, I tried to get as many of my friends to cameo as I could because I knew it was about to be over. Or maybe this is all unrelated? No, the Emeralds are tangled up in this somehow, that's for sure. Ugh, this is so confusing.
Attention.
Huh?
Visiting hours will be over shortly. Please make your way to the nearest exit as soon as possible.
Hey, buddy, are you finished with your visit?
Oh, yeah. I'm just going. Thanks. This set right here, which was outside the prison, was not even really a set at all. It was just two boxes with brown paper over them and green paper to represent grass. It was a one-time appearance, so it didn't need to be anything special. Also, it was outside of a prison, so it's not like there would be a ton of props or color or anything. The main thing I wanted to show there was how the lighting changed from a somewhat dark and drab prison, which was shot during the night, to being outside where the colors are brighter and much warmer, which was shot during the day. Bedlam is voiced by Evan, also known as Mardiculous, and he was a joy to work with and did such a phenomenal job falling into the role. His debut was great, but he one-upped himself in his performance several times over in the next two episodes. I'm so incredibly thankful to have worked with Evan because once I explained the story to him and he realized what this was and how it was the ending to something that was already very large and established, he took a lot of care into, getting the character right and helping me bring him to life. Sometime soon, another round of commentaries with cast members will be going up, and you can enjoy me and him talking over these last 3 episodes. Right here is a reference to Sonic Adventure 2, and more specifically Shadow's creation in reference to Gerald and Chaos Energy. I conveniently leave out the whole Black Doom alien DNA thing because I'm a little on the fence about that in the first place in the official Sonic canon, so I just chose to not mention it in my series at all. I've said before that the adventure games are definitely canon to my series, and probably Heroes too, and here is one of the only instances this late in the show that a key event from them is called upon, which includes Maria's death. Maria is almost never mentioned in the series, so if someone was unfamiliar with the Sonic story, watched this, they would probably be confused for a number of reasons, but especially the Maria line, they'd be like, what? Who's Maria? I don't understand. At this point, Shadow as a character has moved on from Maria, and that's, really far back in his past and he's not on it anymore, but it can still be a sore subject for him, and coming from Bedlam, it just ends up pissing him off. This episode features a new and improved chaos control effect I had for the rest of the show. I was just sick of how bland and static I made chaos control look in the past with like a white flash, and I wanted to give it more life here. I'll go more in depth with it in the documentary, but it now involved an inverted frame as well as the levels being turned up and down all in the span of about 8 frames or so. It's really quick. There was also a very specific sound I used for chaos control now, which was one that I made of, out of a bunch of other sound effects combined. Later, when Shadow and then Sonic used chaos control in the next 2 episodes, I put a different spin on either sound to make it slightly different for each character.
Irritate me so much. Except with him, there's at least some level of respect. This holier-than-thou attitude you've got is what's infuriating. You think that just because you're this supposed moderator that you can do and say whatever you want.
Well, I'd say that there's some truth to that after all.
Knuckles, look out! What? Damn it. If only I had... Wait a minute.
Having Shadow turn super here was a way to show how serious Bedlam was as a threat, having Shadow to resort to the emeralds, and it also served to further piss Bedlam off even more, because Shadow was using them right in front of Bedlam, who just said, like, dude, you can't use the emeralds, it's bad. Bedlam always viewed Shadow as a mistake, sort of, thinking that he shouldn't exist as a being, because he was made from, chaos energy and in an unnatural way. But him using the Chaos Emerald sends him over the edge and adds him to the list of people Bedlam wants to get rid of. I also knew from the beginning that in the final fight, Sonic would be the only one to go super, so it was one last hurrah for Shadow's super form, even though it's kind of short-lived here. Sonic is just about to enter the scene, and it's revealed that he had been watching the fight for a little bit before deciding to jump in. A lot of people were quick to call this a reference to Dragon Ball Z Battle of Gods, where Goku does basically the exact same thing. Now, I don't remember writing this as a reference to that film. I am a Dragon Ball fan, and I have seen Battle of Gods, so it's possible that it was like an unconscious callback, but I didn't write it in as like, oh yeah, like Battle of Gods, and Goku did this in the movie. It honestly kind of seemed like something Sonic would do, and Sonic and Goku do have somewhat similar characteristics in some areas, so it made a little bit of sense. Another Dragon Ball comparison made was that of the Chaos Emeralds to the Dragon Balls themselves, in the sense that they were being used too much and caused negative side effects. And then of course the comparison was made between Bedlam and Omega Shenron. This one I was a little more aware of when I was writing. I'm not big into GT, but when I first came up with the idea of the emeralds being used too much, that plot point immediately came to mind and I remembered how it was done in GT. Side effects and reasons differed, as did Bedlam as a character to Omega Shenron, so really the only similarities are that, the objects these characters rely on is put into a state of distress, a character says that they're using them too much, and that character is the final antagonist.
That's good. Why, you? Enough!
So, it would seem that you're finally here to face your fate, Sonic.
That symbol.
But I'm guessing you won't go without a fight.
If I heard correctly, your name was Bedlam? Is that it? That doesn't sound right.
That's Bedlam. It's nice to finally speak with you after all this time of simply observing.
Oh, that's creepy. I didn't catch all of it. What's this guy's story?
He says that he's the moderator of—
On second thought, fill me in after I've kicked him into the dirt for attacking my friends.
It's all the same to me, but they did attack first.
Yeah, right after you told us you were here to kill Sonic. Very original.
Bedlam quickly takes Sonic out here and comes close to killing him, but the others get him out quick enough and Bedlam ends up giving them a time limit. This was an easy way for me to show how dangerous and powerful Bedlam is, and take the emeralds away from the characters and give them the challenge of going against Bedlam without them. And of course, the specific time limit adds a lot of tension. The color and overall look of Bedlam's energy blasts would remain pretty consistent throughout the rest of the show, kind of this purple color. When Bedlam stops time with Chaos Control, I actually took the portion of the song that was playing, which is a remix of Open Your Heart, at that specific moment and slowed it down and reversed it to give a sort of altered effect from the Chaos Control. Here there is a remix of Bloody Tears from Castlevania, and its relevance, in fact, stems all the way back to when AJ and I were writing the original plan for the crossover. We were going out of our way to search for original songs and even some remixes that were on a different level compared to the kind of music we used for our shows at the time. I always loved Bloody Tears, and for the record, the entire Castlevania soundtrack is awesome. I came across this remix and thought we should use it. As you know, the crossover never happened, but one of the things I carried over was Bloody Tears being a sort of theme for Bedlam, in a way, playing here and then once again at the end of episode 26. This remix playing was in fact, the same remix I put down initially on the list of music for us to use all those years ago. That shot of Tails flying off looks a little janky, and I remember thinking it did when I made it, but it took a lot of tweaking, and at the end of the day, I think that's just the best I could come up with in how I set the shot up.
Is half the reason I showed up after all. But if you truly think you're worthy of being able to possess the emeralds, then show me what you're capable of without them. I'll give you a deadline of 1 week's time until I return to take Sonic's life. And ultimately Ivo Robotnik's. And yours as well, Shadow.
You've gotta be kidding me!
Until then, farewell.
I actually did turn the camera on its side to accomplish this shot, as I wanted it to be a POV shot from Sonic who is waking up. The conversation that Tails is having on the phone is a call with Dash, filling him in on what happened to Sonic. In the summer of 2017 is when I launched my official Discord server, which was public for a good few months before I eventually limited it to only my friends. This episode went up in September of that year, making it the first episode to be released during the lifespan of my server. As a result, I held a big scheduled call to watch the episode for the first time, much like how I've always done in private calls with the boys. There were more people in the server back then, and the turnout for the call was ridiculous. Like, so many people in Friends Chat showed up to watch. It feels like a lightning strike in that sense, because I don't think we'd ever be able to coordinate that amount of people ever again. One of my greatest memories from said call was Supersonic Boom checking in to watch the episode, but ended up only listening to the audio as he was literally in class while the call was going, and he is the realest friend and MVP for doing this. Then he proceeded to go through a McDonald's drive-thru live on call, and he didn't even know we could hear him doing it. He was just like, yeah, I'll take a whatever he was getting. The man don't give an F about nothing. That was a pretty important call for a number of reasons, one of which affected the quality of the last 2 episodes, and it was a comment from my buddy Stolkin. I hadn't met him prior to the Discord server, and he wasn't as familiar with my show at the time we watched episode 25's premiere. One of the comments he made was about the inconsistency of mouths on characters and how it stuck out to him. He didn't make it in a rude way or anything. It was a very real criticism that he noticed specifically because he hadn't seen much of the show before. For some reason, that really stuck with me far into the production of episodes 26 and 27. And while working on them, I already had the mentality of go big or go home, so I ended up putting mouths on so many more shots than I would have if he hadn't said something like that. Compare that to this episode where mouths are very selective, and ever since it's really, it really sticks out to me here, like when I come across a shot where a character could so easily have a mouth and they don't. I thought I could get away with only doing mouths sometimes back then, but for someone who was not so familiar with the show to make a very accurate criticism like that, I knew something had to be done. Similarly, a lot of people pointed out how bad this Sonic figure's hips were starting to look. I had been using this specific figure for quite a while in the show, and the hip joints started to get looser and more flimsy as a result. So what I ended up doing was using the superglue trick, multiple times, which is when you take a little bit of super glue and put it in the joint that is loose, and then you move the part back and forth so the glue sets into the joint and creates sort of like an added layer for the figure's parts to move on. That white looking stuff on the hips is, the dried glue from doing this more than a couple times. And you can make out the same result on one of Knuckles' elbow joints where I used the same trick. But yeah, other than just glue, the joints weren't looking so hot anymore, so I switched out what Sonic I was using in the next 2 episodes.
Lives of not only you and the Doctor, but me as well.
Seriously?
Man, who the heck does he think he is? Giving us some time limit like we're a couple of suckers that have nothing better to do than to sit around waiting for him? When I see him next, I'm not holding anything back.
Are you saying that you were holding back against him?
Well, no, I don't know. I've never fought someone like that before. That power, it was unprecedented. Yeah, that.
Knuckles, your ancestors were directly involved with the emeralds. Have you ever heard of this supposed moderator before? I'm still having some trouble wrapping my mind around all of this.
No, I can't remember anything like that. Even if we assume that he's bluffing, it doesn't change the fact that he remains an immediate threat to us. And I hate to admit it, but I don't know if there's any reason to doubt him in the first place.
Not even a little?
I mean, if he's capable of all this, then what reason would he have to lie about being the supposed moderator anyway?
The yellow doorway arch in this shot has tape on it to hold the Legos in place and also the image, but it was really reflective tape, and it kept producing obnoxious, inconsistent glares between frames, so I ended up using a mask here where I cut part of the arch and layered it on top of other frames. You can still make out some inconsistency with the glares when characters move, but it looks a lot better than it would have if I left it untouched. To the right of Tails' table, you can make out a small Sega Genesis, which is a keychain released by Kid Robot as a part of their Blind Box Sonic line, and that now lives on my keys. Another instance of me breaking the 180-degree rule, but this time I had my reasons for it because it was important to show both characters looking at the screen while it remains unseen to the audience. But I could have easily done it in a different way and had Tails put the laptop on a table that was already facing this angle by default. The 180-degree rule is obviously not, set in stone, and you can break it and it is broken in movies, but when I break it in my show, it's easy to tell since so much of my show is filmed at very similar angles throughout. This is, I think, hands down the best scene of the episode, and building tension between Robotnik and Bedlam with not a ton of dialogue was a lot of fun. Bedlam's interaction with the jail guard off-screen served as a sort of window peering into how his interactions with other people can be, and how he's kind of a normal guy outside of doing his job. More of that side of Bedlam will be shown in the last 2 episodes. This shot composition was a direct parallel to a similar shot in the last episode, only it had Sonic on the left and Robotnik on the right, which, in the grander scheme of things, is main character on left and villain on right. Here, the shot is flipped, with Robotnik on the left and Bedlam taking the position on the right, showing how now Bedlam is considered the villain to Robotnik and how things have taken such a turn. For this shot, and I think one of the sister shots in episode 24, where the characters are seen in practically direct profile, the jail bar was added digitally because actually getting the piece with all the jail bars to work in shots like that was hard, and I didn't want to bother. I think there might be a shot where I actually did use it in 24, but in here and in 27 going forward, it was added digitally with shots like that. Of course, I could have taken one of the bars off and shot with it standing between them, but at that point I might as well just add it digitally because I don't want to run the risk of it moving or reflections bouncing off of it. Bedlam here spares Robotnik, and it's not like he seals his own fate, but if he killed Robotnik here, Metal Sonic obviously would not have appeared and helped Sonic in the next episode. I had always intended on revealing Bedlam's name at the beginning, but when it came to writing the final scene, I briefly played with the idea of him not revealing his name up until the very last line of the episode, and I found that it did not work at all, so I did not do it. For the credits, I used an instrumental cover of the Linkin Park song Figure 09 by Unborn Guitar Player. Linkin Park has had that stigma about only being edgy music for teenagers for years now, but I genuinely like a lot of their stuff. The inclusion of it as the credit song was for 2 reasons, one of which knowing that Bedlam might initially be perceived as an edgy character, and I wanted to temporarily embrace that before showing that that's not really how he is and showing the other sides to him as a character. The other part was as a tribute to Chester Bennington, who passed a few months before this episode went up. And sure, it might sound strange to say that I paid tribute in my Sonic fan show, but it was the largest creative outlet I had, so I thought I'd do what I could. To clear up any confusion or speculation about this post-credit scene, it is, of course, Robotnik making a call to activate Metal Sonic, which he briefly explains next episode. The startup code he inputs is KHSNO93, which stands for Kazuyuki Hoshino, the character designer behind Metal Sonic in the real world, and 93 is simply taken from 1993, the year Sonic CD came out, which was the debut of Metal Sonic.
User, Ivo Robotnik. Startup code KHSNO93. Initiate startup.
And now we arrive at the two-part finale of the show, starting with episode 26, Shot in the Dark. It's crazy to finally be doing the commentaries for these, because the whole time I was working on them, I was just looking forward to doing the commentaries for the entire show. But I'm also very excited to talk about these in particular because their production is the freshest in my mind. This title card was created as a direct parallel to the title card for 25. That one had Sonic front and center with Bedlam looming over to the left, and this one has Bedlam front and center with Sonic looming over to the right. It even uses the same staticky background with the Chaos Emeralds. I'm currently working on the documentary, which shows off a lot of the production of both 26 and 27, so I'm going to try to not just repeat everything that I'm going to say there in this commentary. This scene was very important for Bedlam as a character because it showed how he is when he's not focused on his job necessarily, and how he can interact with others, in this case, Big. Later, it's revealed that Bedlam had been cooped up in the moderator dimension for God knows how long, so I wanted to make him socially awkward to an extent, since, he hasn't had anyone to talk to for years and years, but he's also pretty mild-mannered and, genuinely a nice guy. Making him connect and talk with Big was charming because Big is just about the most carefree and easygoing character in the Sonic series. I feel like Big and Bedlam would be good friends if Bedlam was ever able to return to Earth. I thought of doing this scene with Bedlam getting frustrated as soon as Big introduces Froggy, since he would recognize him as the same frog that swallowed the emerald and got tangled up with Chaos, and then he would have stormed off. But luckily AJ was there to convince me to not do it that way and instead go through with what I originally intended to show, with Bedlam being a likable character. If he had gotten frustrated, it wouldn't have shown him likable at all. It just would have been like, alright. He wouldn't have gotten any sympathy at the end of the show because of his fate. Some people have pointed out that Bedlam appears similar to Beerus in that he's eating all this delicious food that Earth offers. I don't go too in-depth into the rules and lore of when someone becomes moderator, but they likely don't actually need to eat to survive at that point, because they're like somewhat of a higher being. That's why Bedlam sort of goes crazy in tasting everything since it's been so long since he has. I had the ideas for 26 and 27 in my head for so long, and I just remember finishing 25 and immediately getting pumped up to finish the story. That's one reason why both episodes were completely written only a few months after 25 went public. Going into them, I knew I would be making them at the same time, sort of like one right after the other, but there were things I was still working on in 26 as I edited 27. So, as I talk about these, forgive me if I tend to jump forward or backward, talking about either episode, because it's hard to not do so. They're very much two halves to a whole. The name of this episode, Shot in the Dark, is in reference to how these characters have never experienced anything like this, and they are trying to find their way as they went, like taking a shot in the dark, or a leap of faith, in a way. It's also named after an EP by Chef Special, a band I really like. The EP is named Shot in the Dark and features a song with the same title. I'd highly recommend checking it out. It's only 4 songs and it's on YouTube. It's not for everyone, but I like it quite a bit. The EP's cover art can be seen in the background of Tails' basement by the stairs above the letter E. If you can believe it, I originally intended for the entire final fight between Sonic and Bedlam to take place in only this episode, not in 27 at all. When that was the case, I had named this episode Pacify, as in quelling Bedlam's anger by beating him, but I'm glad I changed it to Shot in the Dark, it just sounds a lot cooler. And by extension, I'm very glad I split the final battle between both episodes because it would have been way too much to cram into this one with everything else going on. It also worked out because what I had in mind for 27 was not enough to make the full runtime, so splitting the fight and having it conclude next episode made it feel more complete. It also just added to suspense. Speaking of names, I don't think I commented on Bedlam's name in the last episode, other than the fact that I was really tight-lipped and keeping it a secret. I was looking through synonyms of the word chaos and came across Bedlam, which means a scene of uproar or confusion. And, in addition to the word sounding pretty cool, that seemed to fit pretty perfectly given how he's introduced. The stairs back there don't actually go anywhere. This is a normal set with nothing above, so simply adding a staircase adds to the illusion that they are underneath something. Color correction is something I had been taking seriously up until now, but in these last two episodes I really worked with it in a more in-depth way to make certain scenes look completely different from others. For example, the lighting in Tails' basement is very harsh red and yellow, adding a feeling of warmth to an extent, whereas above in Tails' actual lab, it looks a little whiter and flushed out a little more, kind of like looking like interior fluorescent lights. I wanted to imply that this was taking place during the evening, so all the lights inside would be turned on. Neither set looked like that in the raw stills I took. I had to make that change digitally.
Careless. Please do.
Okay, that's enough. Break it up, you two.
Come on. We almost made it an entire week without you two fighting.
Yeah, Tails, you owe me $10.
Dang it.
Guys, knock it off. Sparring is one thing, but outright fighting with each other isn't gonna get us anywhere.
Fine. You're right. Look, I think this whole situation is just causing some of us to be on edge.
I don't know what the hell you're talking about!
I see what you mean.
That's usually how he is. Tails, I'm sorry. I know you've been working your butt off up there, and you're doing a great job.
Thanks, Sonic. It's okay.
You guys too. We've been training really hard, and I didn't mean to discredit that. Even if we're nervous about tomorrow, I believe in us. Sure, it's a big deal. It might even be the toughest thing we've faced. But if we pull...
I said it back in episode 21, but I do want to reiterate that episodes 26 and 27 are my favorite of all the stop motion work I've done. The visuals alone are the best looking out of the series, and this is due to me taking extra special care and focusing on them to make them look better than I ever have. Going back to what I said in 25, my overall energy during the process of making these was go big or go home. With previous episodes, I might have skimped out and not tweaked little things because I could get away with them, but here I had no excuses to not make this look as good as I possibly could, because this was the end of the show. If there was ever a time to go all out, this was it. Like I said, I animated mouths a lot more in these last two. If I had to guess, I'd say mouths are present probably twice as often than they were before, which of course adds to the overall workload, which was already enormous. But then there were a lot of tiny things too, like creating little mask frames to fix very small errors in animation, like if Sonic moved his arm in one frame alone and he wasn't supposed to. I'll be going over a lot of these tweaks in the documentary. This set was so much fun to make, and I think if I had to pick a favorite set from the entirety of my show, this would be it. I got to tear up a lot of buildings to illustrate an abandoned and unfinished construction site, or just an abandoned part of a city. It's kind of kept ambiguous as to where exactly this is, but there's a lot of construction equipment around, so, construction site. And there are a lot of holes showing the insides of buildings, which adds, good amount of depth to this scene. All the little road signs and barrels and stuff came from a lot of 30 miniature construction playset accessories I ordered on eBay. I'm thankful that I was able to get them all at once instead of trying to piece, everything together slowly. Behind Shadow there is a wall with a sign that says "Post no bills." Sometimes you'll see these in public, and as jokes, sometimes people like put pictures of Bill Cosby or Bill Murray around them. Well, I took my own approach to that and put pictures of Bill Freiberger around it, one of the writers on Sonic Boom. Some specific lines that weren't super integral to the story I had in my head for a long time. For instance, Knuckles getting offended at Sonic saying it's going to take a lot more than a red guy with dumb hair to rattle us, only for him to confirm he isn't talking about Knuckles. About half of this episode alone is fighting, and I knew before I wrote either script that they would be heavily dependent on combat. So I tried my hardest to put everything I had into making the combat look as good as I could. This scene was rewritten the most out of any scenes from either episode. I had originally intended for the gang to basically round up their militia with the Chaotix and Radniks and other characters, but it got really cluttered when trying to make them all fight Bedlam, so I limited it to the main gang that fought him previously, and addressed this in-universe when Tails was like, "Are you sure we shouldn't get them? Because, you know, that's more help." And I thought Sonic's reasoning made sense. It was also an excuse for me to not animate as many characters, so that was nice too. Zalvandor was even going to appear in the same way Metal Sonic does, sort of saving Sonic from a hit from Bedlam, but it was getting to be way too much, you know, especially if I'd have to have Sonic be saved by two different characters in the span of only minutes. It felt repetitive. Aside from those changes, though, the choreography itself was rewritten several times. I would get going in writing it and then step away, only to come back to the script and change, like, everything I wrote, basically. The bit where Sonic steps away to find Tails and Amy and ultimately turns super, I originally had it planned out as Bedlam knocking him into a building, which happened to be the same building Tails and Amy were, and then he would bust out of the top and it would reveal like, oh, it's Super Sonic, he transformed. I went with him stepping out because it would have been coincidental for Bedlam to knock him into the exact building he needed to be in, and with how the set was organized, getting the right angles for that sequence would have been a little difficult. Instead, I had it that Shadow gets knocked into the lower level of the building, where then he's down for the count.
And with every blow, you keep getting back up, wasting your time and making this more painful for everyone involved. I've seen enough. If you just lie down and die, I could end this all now!
Look out!
What the... is that...
What?
Introducing Metal Sonic in this way I liked a lot, and then having the, you know, the message from Robotnik play right here. When it came to making the fight scene for this episode, I wanted it to have specific anchoring points to stand out. Things like Metal Sonic jumping in, Shadow using full power without his inhibitor rings, Sonic turning super, stuff like that. It was the last fight scene before it turned into the final one-on-one with Bedlam, so I tried to do as much as I could with other characters. If anyone was wondering, this shot is not a reference to the famous shot from the Sonic OVA where you have Sonic and Metal Sonic kind of crossing the screen. I didn't even realize it looked like that until after I made it. I was instead going for a, you know, like an interesting way of panning the frame and having it look more dynamic, similar to how shows that used celluloids in how they panned and moved different layers at different angles. Much like the entire scene, Robotnik's message got rewritten several times, some of which were much longer and felt like they were dragging on too long. I whittled it down to as concise as I could get it, which made sense because he's recording this right after activating Metal Sonic via phone in prison, so who knows how long he has for the phone call and who knows how long activating Metal Sonic took in the first place. I had written in silver saying rapid fire time when he throws all these objects at Bedlam, but changed it when AJ and I were recording because it felt a little goofy in the long run. Bedlam throwing the slow sign at Sonic was always intentional, like it was always something I wanted to do. One of the drafts even had him swinging and hitting him with it multiple times. Evan even recorded two alternate lines, neither of which were used. One where he tells Sonic to slow down, and another one where he tells Sonic to watch his speed. Those were in the script, I just went against it because they felt a little silly. Some of Metal Sonic's techniques making a return here, like the energy shield and electric arm move. The sounds that Metal Sonic make in terms of what could be considered his lines, I guess, or his voice, like those are the voice files taken from Mario and Sonic at the Rio Olympic Games. I was very pumped to have Shadow flick off his inhibitor rings for several reasons. I had him do the same all the way back in episode 14, but it was very brief and didn't really show what he was capable of. He just ended up coming very close to death. I intended for this portion of the fight to be Shadow's true last hurrah in the series, and the music I used here was Who I Am by Magnify, which apparently was originally intended to be used in Shadow the Hedgehog as one of his themes, but I think it can be found on one of their normal studio release albums. As I'll show in the documentary, I did in fact make custom hands for him when he flicks off his inhibitor rings, where I simply took a pair of Sonic hands and painted the cuffs with black acrylic paint, and then it looked like, oh, his rings and his cuffs are gone. Of course, like some people were like, oh, he still has his shoe cuff or his shoe rings, and it's like, oh, okay, I can only do so much. Give me a break. The figure I used was also the shiny paint variant that came with silver in the comic book pack from Jazzwares. I only did it because my normal Shadow, I was having trouble getting his hands off, so I instead used this one. It worked to my advantage, though, because it made Shadow look different temporarily. Also, I did not intend for the powered-up form to be red throughout the entire sequence, just when he transformed or moved really fast, but the more I looked at it, the more I knew it looked really cool. So I was like, dang it, now I gotta make him red throughout the entire thing, which meant cutting out every single frame of Shadow as a PNG through that entire sequence. And yeah, that took about as long as it sounds. Since it was something I could continue on in the episode without editing, I was well into, editing episode 27 before I finally came back and finished that sequence. Making Shadow red was like one of the last things I did in either of these episodes. When both Shadow here and Supersonic move really fast or launch from a spin dash, I used a gunshot sound effect to give it that much more impact, and usually had the motion just be a PNG that moved very quickly off screen for only a couple frames. And I also blurred it. That's also very important to make things look very fast. Just blur it. When the ideas for this episode were still in my head and not all typed out, I wanted this part where Sonic transforms to be done completely differently, and had it out in the open in front of Bedlam. If you remember, there is a shot at the end of Sonic Unleashed where he uses the emeralds to turn super, and the camera is spinning around him as he does so. I basically wanted to replicate that shot. It would have been complicated, but I did have it worked out in terms of how I would do it. I would have to make another side of the set, so it was a completely 360-degree set, completely enclosed. So I would take pictures of the camera and I would just turn it around so I have a completely circular view, and then I would take pictures of Sonic also moving in the same direction as he transforms, and then cut all of those out as PNGs, layer them over the background so it looks like it's the camera moving around both of, the background and Sonic, and then the emeralds would appear and that's how he would transform. I'm glad I ended up having him just kind of burst out of the building, because it made more sense for him to do it that way. Right here, Tails explains that while the EEM might have pushed things over the edge and made Bedlam appear, it did actually succeed at draining the emeralds of their excess energy. Then Tails was able to match that energy to Sonic's properties, allowing him to turn super without the emeralds. I thought this would be a really cool workaround, and of course, in the story, it comes as quite the surprise to Bedlam. After the episodes were out, David wondered if this was in reference to Vegeta turning Super Saiyan 4 in GT through artificial means. I think it was like the Blutzwave generator or something like that. And it wasn't intended as a direct reference, but I definitely noticed the similarities after I wrote it in. Basically, I was just trying to find a way to have Sonic turn super without the emerald, because you can't have a final fight, without Super Sonic, or at least I believe that. And, it also served as a way for him to use his hypersonic form for the first and only time in my series next episode. Bedlam is getting ready to transform, and from his perspective, he's doing so because he's shifted into more of a panic mode after seeing Supersonic. And even though he tells Sonic that it's going to be the last nail in his coffin, he knows that he's gone over the edge at this point, and he'll admit that next episode. The moderator of the Chaos Emeralds is never supposed to use the emeralds themselves. They're just supposed to guard them and keep them in line. I had the design of Frantic Bedlam for basically the same amount of time as the normal design of him, and worked on the redesigns at the same time, and then as a result also had both figures made at the same time. It wasn't a situation where I designed normal Bedlam and then was like, okay, now I have to come up with a super form. They were kind of like together. He was always intended to have a transformation, and I'm happy that once I got his story all worked out, I could give him his super form, but it have added significance to it rather than just the bad guy powering up. I finally decided on the name Frantic Bedlam much later than when I designed him, and well into the production of the final episodes. I don't think I finally decided on the name until after 27 was already out. I had intended on naming him Chaos Bedlam, but then Chakra X revealed that that was the name of the new form he made for Nazo, so I had to go a different direction. I'm much happier with Frantic Bedlam, though. It adds more tension to the form in just the name alone. I was a little more hands-on with this set than I've ever been before, having characters get knocked into buildings like we just saw with Bedlam, and that wasn't accomplished digitally. I did, in fact, take individual frames of me punching holes and ripping the building apart. It's tricky to do that sometimes because you only have one shot. You can't exactly reshoot something like that. The shot where Sonic busts out of the building I had intended to animate in the same way, but that cardboard was really difficult to cut up and still have it stay there, so I had to remove it from the set and cut it up how you see it in the next couple shots after he does so. There's a couple of other instances of buildings in this set getting affected by combat, like when Sonic spin dashes Bedlam into the same building he knocked him into. You can see I animated a little dent in that building. Also, when Shadow misses Bedlam and punches the structure behind him, he not only damages the building, but he also moves it back a little bit. It was a nice way to show how powered up Shadow was at this point. That shot with Sonic and Bedlam, colliding their punches was some of the most fun sound editing to do in this episode. Very similar to the way that the sound editing of Sonic's Knightmare sequence in episode 24 was fun. But editing the visuals was equally a blast, because I wanted to make things look like they were warping as much as possible, and when it came to editing that, I laid out the general groundwork of it and then just kept tweaking things from there. There wasn't even any actual movement in that sequence from either Sonic or Bedlam. It was only 4 still frames with effects added onto them, like shaking and inverting, mirroring, and stuff like that. If you go back to 24, you'll notice that the text at the beginning of the credits loses its color, followed by 25, where the text and logo of the show both lose their color. This was meant to show the characters not being able to harness the power of the emeralds, and then how they're taken from them altogether. At the end of the credits here, the text appears as gray at first, and then is lit up in a blue color, meant to show that even without the emeralds themselves, they were still able to manage with a transformation and use remnants of their energy. That's some little detail probably no one noticed, but it was a neat way to have more fun with the credits than usual. And the shot behind the credits is all the emeralds together, which is very blurry and colorless, and then it gradually zooms out and gets more saturated. and you can kind of make out that it is the emeralds. The white flash in them at the end is meant to foreshadow Hypersonic's appearance next episode. Episode 27, Forward. Well, here we are at the grand finale. The series at this point has come so far from where it first started, and I'm just so happy things went the way they did. The year I spent working on both 26 and 27 together was hell on me at certain points, but when I finally finished everything, I felt so accomplished. Even back when I was working on episode 25, I knew I was going to be working on 26 and 27 together as a pair. Why did I do this? Why didn't I just stick to my normal schedule and release 26 much sooner like it would have come out if I didn't choose to work on them together? I've said before that I feel like episodes 26 and 27 are very much two halves to a whole. Episode 27 picks up literally right after 26 ends, and if you chained them together and got rid of 26's credits, you'd just have one big mega episode, and that's how they're going to be presented in the season uploads going up sometime soon. Because they're so reliant on each other, I didn't want them to be separated by the usual amount of time between my episodes. 24 came out in February of 2017, and 25 came out in September. That was way too much time to have between these two. Instead, I decided on working on them together and then releasing them only 1 week apart. That felt like the perfect time frame to separate them by. As an extension of this, I had planned from the beginning for 26 to end on "to be concluded" and then drop the date 27 would be going up. I also only made one trailer for both of these episodes together because if I dropped the date for 27 at the end of 26, I don't need to make a trailer for 27 specifically. And if I worked on them together, why didn't I just combine them into one big 50-minute finale? Well, because there's less fun in that, that's why, and not as much suspense. This scene was of course shot on the same set right after I finished shooting for 26, literally the very next day. I just kept the same set up the entire time. This moment where Shadow is reflecting on how he wasn't able to defeat Bedlam, I intended to be one last moment of development for his character. He realizes the weight of everything and that Sonic is now the only one who can manage something that he could not. Knuckles is even surprised by this, sort of expecting Shadow to become hysterical about how he couldn't win, but instead seeing him swallow his pride. This extends to him being the one to drive home the fact that Sonic can indeed do this, and is their last hope over the communications later on. It was important to make Shadow be the one to do this. Later at the party, he's civil towards Sonic and even thanks him for pulling off what he was unable to. I've given a good amount of thought to what Shadow would be like in this universe going forward and past what we see here. I would have it so Shadow gains a good amount of respect for Sonic after beating Bedlam to begin with, but especially now that he has the title of moderator. His days of being petty and viewing Sonic as less than him are more or less done. This fight involved a lot of PNG editing because there's so many times the characters are jumping or flying up in the air. I had to cut out approximately 12 to 1300 frames of PNGs for this fight, and that took as long as it sounds. The part where Sonic collides with Bedlam and they hit each other quickly multiple times was my attempt to do more Dragon Ball Z style combat where characters are moving very quickly. It's hard to get it to look right in stop motion, and I still don't think it came out looking exactly right. David did a good job of that in stop motion in Super Saiyans vs. Super Hedgehogs 2, so go check that out.
Oh yeah, sorry I want to stay alive. You know what I've survived in the past, don't you? I guess in that sense, the odds are stacked against you!
Well, there's a first time for everything. This is where your abuse of the Chaos Emeralds comes to an end!
Jeez, abuse this, abuse that. You're a frickin' broken record! Is using the Chaos Emeralds even worthy of death in the first place?
Under normal circumstances, no. But you're a whole different set of circumstances, Sonic. You and Ivo, time and time again, pushing them to their limit. I'm surprised you don't feel more guilty over it.
That's where you're wrong. 90% of the time I use them, I was either taking them from Eggman or preventing him from doing something like taking over the city or even the planet.
Are you really telling me that the way we used them was the same?
This shot composition was one of my favorites from the episode, with back and forth shots of Bedlam and Sonic, but not having their eye lines meet, showing that they do not see eye to eye. You'll also notice that Bedlam is in between the red and purple pillars, whereas Sonic is in between the blue and yellow pillars. They both have the color of their normal look and their super form look on either side of them. The set for the moderator dimension was kept very basic because I just wanted it to be the space for the final fight to take place uninterrupted by anything else around them. It was also lit with lamps, meaning that I could shoot it at night and for pretty much however long I wanted to in individual sessions, meaning that it took much less time to shoot than the previous fight scene in the abandoned city. I wanted to include Zalvandor and other characters from the series to sort of tie up loose ends for them to, or just at least give them a little bit of final screen time. Zalvandor is here with a different arm now, as Zerato destroyed his original arm back in episode 23. I wanted to show that Robotnik does have some kind of understanding of what is happening on the outside world, even if he can't see it. I think he feels the earth shake, and he just knows Sonic is involved with it somehow. After being around him for so long, he developed a sort of sixth sense about these kinds of things. When Sonic is beaten down right here, you can see his particle aura grow very faint to show that he's weakened, and when the gang boosts his confidence, you can start to see the opacity grow more and more until it's back to normal. The part where all the characters say "finish this now" in unison was directly inspired by Dragon Ball Z, where Goku is about to finish Kid Buu, and you see the characters, like, Goku, Goku, Dad, Kakarot, do it! And then he blows Kid Buu up. I even had the characters appear on screen in a fragmented way, similar to how it was done in that portion of Dragon Ball. They're fragmented differently, but it was inspired by that. Something I love in anime is when the OP is used as an insert song somewhere in the episode, which usually signifies a huge event for the series, or even the grand finale or the final battle. That's exactly what I wanted to do here when Live and Learn kicks in, because I always considered it the theme of my show, since it is used in the openings after all. From the moment it kicks in to the end of the fight, this scene was written to a specific shortened mix of Live and Learn I edited myself. You can hear it start as an instrumental and then turn into the full version with vocals. Even though I wrote it to the duration of this mix, getting the final timing was a little bit tricky, and I ended up having to tweak certain things, but it ended up coming out a-okay. Hypersonic is about to enter the mix, which I was ecstatic about doing in my show, because what's bigger than Supersonic? Hypersonic, baby, that's what. I originally got the idea years ago when I was messing around in After Effects. Actually, when I had made the particle aura that's on Supersonic, I changed the effects around and made it look like what Hypersonic's aura does look like in this show, with the more star-like shine as it has appeared in other media. In Sonic 3 and Knuckles, the Hyper form is achieved via the Super Emeralds, but those don't exist in my show, so I had to come up with a good way for Sonic to actually use this form in the first place. Since I had him go Super without the use of the Emeralds themselves, he simply stacks those on top of the variable S energy and achieves the form that way. I don't think I mentioned before, but the S in variable S stands for Super, just in case no one caught that. Hypersonic's appearance in 3 and Knuckles had him flashing different colors, which is something I knew was not going to work in stop motion. I could have technically pulled it off, but I didn't want to, because not only would it have been so much work, it probably would not have looked very great, at least not as good as what I ended up going with, which was making him entirely white, which again was achieved by editing all the frames individually of the Supersonic figure. I didn't actually paint a figure white, that is just a digitally edited Supersonic figure. On top of making him white, I also chose to change his eyes to green because it looked pretty cool and I thought it would make sense. To still give him that element of flashing colors, I came up with this technique where he has after-image doppelgangers appear in the 7 colors of the emeralds, and I had a lot of fun working with that. This final move was very satisfying to me, just with how much finality it has to it, with Sonic shouting Hypersonic Boom, with like reverb echo effect, and all the different flashing colors as he does so. In those flashing frames, you can make out the Chaos Emeralds appearing, and I wanted it to seem like the very thing that defeated Bedlam was the thing he was trying to take away from Sonic and the gang and protect. But of course, his methods were unhinged, or at least became unhinged, and that's why things went the way they did, and why he realizes the error of his ways afterwards. After all this time, here is where we finally learn that the symbol on Bedlam's eye is none other than the mark of the moderator, which appears permanently on the body of whoever is active moderator. It stays on them even after they don't hold the title anymore. When I came up with Bedlam's design, I hadn't yet established this story, so I just made the symbol because it looked cool, and it was like, hey, he's got a symbol on his eye, that's neat. When I eventually settled on Sonic beating him and becoming the moderator, I gave the symbol purpose and had it appear on Sonic as well. Shoutouts to anyone that ever draws Bedlam and gets his eye symbol correct, because it is not on both sides. This was a choice I made when designing the character because slight asymmetrical aspects is something I find pretty cool in character design. On one eye is his mark of the moderator, which comes out much further, and then on the other is just a normal eye ridge highlight in black, similar to Shadow's red highlight in the same place. I of course designed Frantic Bedlam at the same time and had the eye symbol change shape. In how the story is now, perhaps it changes shape to show how he is out of line for using this transformation. Sonic's mark of the moderator appears on his hand instead of on his eye, like Bedlam's. This was mostly decided on because attempting to add the design onto Sonic's face would not have looked good at all, especially since the figure itself is made of a pretty dark blue plastic, and drawing a black design on top of that it wouldn't have stood out very much, but it also would have looked pretty bad. However, there is some plot significance to where the symbol appears. Bedlam's appears on his eye because he spends most of his time with the job watching and observing without interjecting, like the moderators before him have done. In contrast, Sonic takes matters into his own hands, protecting the emeralds in person on Earth. Bedlam watches, so it's on his eye. Sonic acts, so it's on his hand. I don't think I've seen anyone call out the fact that it's actually on his glove, which is kind of nice, you know. There's only so much I can do with these designs at the end of the day. Yeah, he's wearing gloves, it's whatever, it's on his glove. It's on his hand though, it's on both. If he takes his glove off, it's also on his hand. I distinctly remember being able to shoot this scene in Sonic's house in just a few hours, all in one session, which was quite refreshing compared to other scenes that took several to complete. Is there any significance to having Espio be the only one by Sonic's side when he wakes up? No. I just thought it would be cool because we haven't seen Espio in a while, and we rarely see him and Sonic in a scene together, so it's like, oh, what's up, Espio? How you doing? The images on all the walls in Sonic's house were updated for this episode specifically, which is funny to think about because, from an in-universe perspective, his walls had different images in episode 24. Which was the last time we saw it. So we can only assume that sometime during the week of preparation, because 26 takes place 1 week after 25, Sonic was like, man, I've got to redecorate. I know we got to train guys, but these walls, I just got to hang up different art. This was the very first scene of episode 27 to be shot. I did so while shooting all the other appearances of Robotnik in his cell in episode 26 to get them all at once. I shot this before I even started shooting the fight in the abandoned city. That's how far in advance this was shot. I mentioned how I swapped the Sonic figure I was using out when people started to notice how his hips were basically deteriorating. Well, for this scene, I actually used that bad-hipped Sonic. I think that's the last time I ever did so, because that was the figure that I had the hand that had the mark of the moderator on. I later switched the hand onto the proper Sonic figure I used elsewhere, but it never, really fully clicked onto the peg. That's why I was using this one. Giving Sonic the ability of natural chaos control felt very cool, and it's played as a surprise to both Robotnik and the audience here, since the scene where Bedlam says to enjoy the power upgrades has not been shown yet, even though it's already happened. In an early draft, back in Sonic's house, I actually had Amy go to tackle him, and Sonic, accidentally warped a few feet from that using Chaos Control and was like, whoa, what's this? But then I just had him, Bedlam, be like, yeah, you can do it. So it's not as much of a surprise to Sonic when he wakes up in his house. Like I said before, I changed the sounds very slightly between the three characters that use Chaos Control. I changed the visuals as well. There's the base version used by Bedlam back in episode 25, and then I made it turn darker and more purple when he's frantic Bedlam. For Shadow, it appears much more red, and for Sonic, it's much more blue. I loved this being the final scene between Sonic and Robotnik, and my intentions were for Robotnik to be playing the "oh, I'll get you yet as soon as I'm out of here" aspect, but to himself, he knows the reality of it. He knows he'll be imprisoned for a while. Sonic calling Robotnik Ivo here was very important to me because this is the only time he ever does so in my show. I believe Bedlam is the only other one to refer to Robotnik as Ivo. To me, it was sort of like Sonic was now one level higher than Robotnik because now he had the title of moderator. So it was less formal and respectful calling him Robotnik, instead calling him by his first name, which no one else ever does. Having a party take place at the end of the series, I realize, is a little cliche, but at least it's not a dance party for no reason. And in-universe, it feels like the perfect time to have a party. Of course, Amy would want to throw a party if Sonic came back alive and defeated, you know, who she perceives as this evil guy. Like, of course she would want to do that. From the beginning, this scene was written to Friends by Hyper Potions, which I actually miscredit as time trials in the credits. Friends felt like the perfect, lighthearted, feel-good song to use when the party got started, and I never saw any other song being used for it. I extended the beginning part of it to last for the entire time Salvador has his little scene outdoors, because I wanted to, I wanted the change to go along with when Sonic jumps into the party. I thought of maybe switching it to a different song and then returning to Friends, but it made it, like, kind of ping-ponging back and forth between songs, so I just kept Friends. Salvador sort of tables his resentment towards Sonic and pays respect to him for defeating Bedlam, and then asks to join the party, which Gilnov had such great delivery on. The staircase that Sonic dashes up is the same staircase used in Tails' basement set, and it was just held against cardboard to get that angle shot. It was not an actual set I had set up. I did intend to get some interior shots of the downstairs of Amy's house, but they weren't really needed. The upstairs interior set is where the party takes place, and that was a set I wanted to go all out on and make it look like a true party. A lot of the props, like the couch and almost all of the food, I ordered for this scene specifically. This was the last time I'd be making a set, so I wanted to have fun. For the longest time, I intended for everyone to be wearing party hats in this scene, but when trying to make them myself, I couldn't get them to look right. Shadow would be wearing one here, and then at the end of this little moment with Sonic, he would hand a hat to Sonic, and it would have been a small, charming moment between the two of them. This conversation between Sonic and Shadow is done in only one shot, and I wanted to show other movement and energy in the party, so I had Vector walk across the screen, and then I digitally added Gyro to float across the screen. I give Silver and Blaze one last cute little moment while they're, both awkward to each other. I originally had written it so Blaze would be sitting on the couch and Silver would come up and ask to join her, and then the Radniks, they egg them on, and when they both blush, Blaze would have silently placed her hand on Silver's, and he would have freaked out like the little freakazoid he is. Turns out trying to make Blaze actually sit on that couch was damn near impossible, so I just had them standing next to each other. That made it simple. Do they end up going out on a cute date after the series is over? I guess we'll never know. The game Knuckles and Espio were playing back there was none other than Dragon Ball GT Final Bout, with Espio playing as Super Saiyan 4 Goku and Knuckles playing as Super Saiyan Trunks. I had recorded my own sound effect of messing around with a controller back in episode 22, and I think I just reused that same sound back there. Here, the music transitions to an instrumental cover of Panic at the Disco's Impossible Year by Mats Amor. It really gave me a laid-back, end-of-the-evening vibe. Having Vector get drunk was really fun, and Gilnov did such a great job on his line delivery. He improvised the Espio, where the hell are ya? That you can hear in the background when it cuts to Tails. The balcony set that's coming up was one of those things that I had in my mind, and I knew how it was going to look, and then when it finally came time to make it, it looked exactly how I wanted it to, and that was like, oh, this is the best, because that doesn't always happen. I pushed the normal party set back and placed the balcony in front of it, and there weren't any additional lights in the balcony scene. It was just what was being used to light the set behind it. That's how I accomplished that lighting effect of it looking very dim on the balcony and very bright in the background. Here is the last we see of Bedlam, with him staying in the moderator dimension as Sonic is able to return to Earth. Like I said, I have a fair amount of more lore when it comes to the moderators and how the job works and everything, more than we see in the show. Like, for example, I don't really go into why there has to be someone in the moderator dimension at all times. Instead, I just state matter-of-factly that that's how it is. There's other stuff too, like how the title grants each moderator a significantly longer life, a natural connection to the emeralds, which means, changed, altered powers, and so on. Bedlam also mentions in one of those lines that he's not the only, there's been moderators before him, it's not just him. With me saying these things, I want to address the question some will inevitably have after finishing my show, and that's if I intend to make more. I don't. I was content ending the story as we see it here, because I was satisfied with what I had done, and was ready to move on. I'm under the belief, though, that these characters in my series continue on with their lives, we just aren't able to see it. There's things that canonly happen, but we don't ever see them happen. For example, I have vague ideas of, the fates of these characters and adventures that they would go on afterwards, things I consider canon, but we don't. Making them into a reality is something else altogether. That's a lot more work. As a writer, sometimes it's good to end a project feeling completely satisfied with what you did, even if you have ideas on how you could continue it. And at the end of the day, it's important to give things finality and let them end, instead of dragging things out for long periods of time. This is where the meaning of the semicolon in the episode's title comes into play. That was not a typo, that was supposed to be there. With the series coming to an end, but showing that the characters and events continue on after what we see. It ends, but it never really ends. Some have also guessed that the semicolon is supposed to represent the mark of the moderator, which appears in a very similar fashion. The mark of the moderator looks like a semicolon, but I did not intend that at all. But also, I will take that. I thought the passing of the torch to Sonic would be a very interesting note to end on, and I figured it would kind of throw the audience for a loop, as I don't think many saw it coming, but I can't speak for the audience. That you would have to say if you saw it coming or not. In getting the title, there's a lot of responsibility placed on Sonic, and it's not important for us to see him doing his job as moderator, it's just important to know that he will be doing it. Originally, I had this entire scene take place right after the fight and before Sonic wakes up. Rather, of course, he's still in the moderator dimension and it takes place right after the fight, but instead I cut it to take place in like a flashback where Sonic explains something to Tails. Structurally, that felt much stronger to me. I think I was struggling a little bit on how, because I knew what needed to be said and I knew that Bedlam was gonna be taking his place, but finding the pacing was throwing me off. But then when I decided to cut it and take place in a flashback, everything clicked. As Sonic says right here, the emeralds are no longer able to be used, so he suggests getting rid of them by restoring them to the Earth. I found this to be the best note to end on because traveling around the world dispersing the emeralds is set up for their next adventure, and also in the form of a vacation after dealing with so much stress. In the series canon, they do go through with this plan, and the emeralds are restored to the planet, and from there, Sonic is on constant alert in case anything ever happens with them. Editing this final scene felt so surreal. I had this specific scene in my head for so long and knew exactly how I wanted it to go. Even before Bedlam was at all a concept, years and years ago, somehow, some way, I knew that the last scene of my show was going to be Sonic and one other character sharing a scene. Early on it was like Shadow, and then it was Amy, and then I decided on Tails, which works the best in my opinion. While I was editing the animation for this scene, I had to keep stopping and just being like, oh my god, I can't believe I'm finally doing it. Oh my god, this is like, it's all coming together right here. This is ridiculous and it's so crazy.
Well, Bedlam, on the off chance you're able to hear me right now, it looks like you've got nothing to worry about. I never expected I'd be handed down a job so important, but I'm not going to be taking it lightly. You've left the fate of the Chaos Emeralds resting in some very capable hands. So, it looks like this adventure has come to a close. Oh, but that just means another one's getting started, right? And I guess that's it.
It was important for me to not have the text episode 27 shown in the credits here, and instead only have the logo, because this is very much the credit roll for the entire series. Recall my early stop motions, which I also provided commentary on, and how I used to stretch the credits to be longer than they had any right to be. Here I didn't have any padding or anything. The length was determined by the information I included that was important information, and that ended up being about 5 minutes worth of credits. Cast is listed in order of appearance, but it also is, it was very significant to me to have the entire cast of the show listed, including characters that didn't appear in this episode. In addition to that, having previous voice actors and actresses listed was very important to me, because even if they were only here for a short portion of the ride, they had a hand in helping me turn my stories into watchable things. The special thanks section was the thing I wanted to highlight most and just list all of the people that ever had a hand in the series or really inspired me in one way or another while working on it. Towards the end, I give a special thanks to my family and also to Joey and Sam. Those are my dogs, and unfortunately Joey passed before episode 26 went live. We got Joey and Sam, they're the half-sisters. We got them when they were super tiny, like right after they were born, and thankfully Sam is still with us at this time, but Joey was with us for almost 12 years, and she was, oh my god, she was such a sweetheart. Kind of a freak, but in an endearing way. She loved her family. I wanted them to be listed along with everyone else because they were very important to me. I grew up with them around at all times, and we truly love them both. Whenever I would be downstairs shooting at the kitchen table, they would be hanging out with me while I did so. I remember, like, whenever they saw me, you know, when I came down the stairs, normally it was like, whatever, but then when I came down the stairs with my tripod, they knew what was up. They were like, oh, he's gonna shoot, we're gonna hang out with him. I had originally intended to use a remix of Live and Learn called the Sonic Adventure 3 remix, which was a slower version mashed up with instruments from 2 Muse songs, but I think it was copyrighted as a result, which makes sense. It worked out though because the remix was much longer than the credits ended up being. I had always intended for the credits to finish and have it say "The End" on screen because I wanted people to know that this was it and I was done. Well, thank you so much for listening to me talk over my entire series in these creator commentaries. I was so excited to be able to do them, and I hope you got some enjoyment out of these. Thank you for sticking around if you've been following this channel for a while, and thanks even if you're brand new and you're just now finding it. My name's Steven, and I'm signing off. Thanks again, guys. I will see you later.